A nation forged in fire, the epic saga of the War of 1812. Imagine a nascent nation, barely 2 decades beyond its revolutionary birth, teetering on the precipice of existence. Surrounded by formidable empires, menaced by foreign fleets, and fractured by internal dissent, America was about to plunge into a conflict that would rigorously test its very essence. This was no mere skirmish. It was an existential struggle for identity, for unfettered freedom, and for the inherent right to assert its presence on the global stage. From the resonant thunder of cannons echoing across the Great Lakes to the searing inferno that engulfed the halls of Washington, D.C. From fierce and relentless engagements with indigenous allies to the heroic forging of legends like Andrew Jackson, the War of 1812 unfurled as a poignant narrative of indomitable courage, profound heartbreak, and unyielding resolve. Join us as we embark on a profound journey back to this pivotal moment in history, where national borders were irrevocably etched in fire, where heroes were painstakingly sculpted in blood, and where the very bedrock of modern North America was forever transmuted. Chapter 1. The precarious calm before the storm. Following the tumultuous American Revolution, the delicate peace that descended upon the newly independent United States in 1783 was akin to a veil of mist gracefully unfurling from a serene morning lake, tranquil, enchanting, yet profoundly deceptive. Beneath this placid surface, an intricate web of tensions simmered. The uneasy and unresolved relationship between America and the colossal empire it had so recently vanquished. While the Treaty of Paris formally bestowed independence, persistent questions of power, wounded pride, and unresolved grievances lingered, casting long shadows over every bay, frontier, and capital. The revolution had, indeed, concluded, but its reverberating aftershocks continued to ripple across the vast expanse of the continent. American soldiers, many still clad in their tattered uniforms, returned to fields that had only recently been blood-soaked battlegrounds. Women, who had valiantly held families and communities together in the absence of their men, now confronted the monumental task of painstakingly rebuilding their hearths and homes. Towns that once prospered under the colonial economic framework lay hollowed, their intricate economies severely disrupted. The fledgling country, though united in the sweet taste of victory, remained profoundly divided by an pervasive undercurrent of fear of imminent collapse, of renewed invasion, and of an undefined future that no one could yet clearly discern. Britain, too, was grappling with the arduous process of post-war recovery, albeit on a grander, global scale. Despite having ceded vast territories in North America, it steadfastly maintained its status as a dominant maritime power, deeply entrenched in complex European rivalries and burdened with the colossal responsibility of safeguarding an expansive global empire. In the collective consciousness of British statesmen, the American Revolution was perceived as a costly and unfortunate anomaly, rather than a precedent-setting blueprint for colonial independence. Their venerable empire had demonstrably endured. Yet the rebellion served as a stark and undeniable warning. Distant territories, one day, might audacious aspire to autonomy. In those unsettling years, British forts stubbornly persisted on American soil, strategically positioned in the Great Lakes and the sprawling Northwest Territory. Outposts such as Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, and Fort Niagara remained heavily garrisoned, their continued presence far from accidental. Britain meticulously justified their retention by accusing the United States of flagrantly failing to adequately compensate loyalists whose lives had been utterly devastated during the war. Americans, however, viewed these enduring forts as undeniable symbols of lingering British control, transforming unpaid debts into a form of overt military occupation. Each strained suspension of diplomatic engagement only served to deepen the burgeoning rift. The nascent United States, vigilantly watchful in the fragile dawn of its nationhood, found its nascent authority consistently undermined. The very words peace and victory resonated hollowly in the ears of those who witnessed British troops entrenched on what they unequivocally believed to be their sovereign land. American merchants, too, felt the agonizing squeeze of imperial power. Across the expansive Atlantic, British merchants and ruthless privateers seized American vessels with impunity, severely disrupting vital trade routes. Ships heavily laden with lucrative commodities such as tobacco, timber, furs, and rice, goods that should have substantially enriched the burgeoning republic, were unceremoniously snatched or subjected to agonizing delays. Customs officials, acting under palpable British influence, imposed onerous duties that effectively strangled American commerce. America's burgeoning hopes for robust economic growth were ruthlessly throttled by the very hand that had once dictated its markets from distant London. At the very core of this escalating tension lay a fundamental question of maritime rights. Britain's supremacy at sea was irrefutable. They proudly commanded the greatest navy the world had ever witnessed. Yet they wielded this immense power in ways that directly imperiled American interests. Naval blockades, a well-established tactic of wartime, now insidiously extended into periods of purported peace, specifically targeting neutral freight and freedom of navigation. American ships, valiantly attempting to traverse the Atlantic to engage in trade with lucrative markets in Europe and the Caribbean, found themselves navigating a perilous minefield of bureaucratic red tape, crippling tariffs, and omnipresent naval patrols. It was during the relentless throes of the Napoleonic Wars, a cataclysmic conflict that devoured Europe from 1803 onward, that these debilitating strains intensified to an unbearable degree. Britain and France, locked in a brutal and existential struggle, unilaterally declared that neutral ships were legitimate targets if they dared to engage in trade with the enemy. The United States, fiercely committed to maintaining its neutrality, found itself inextricably ensnared in the turbulent currents of European warfare. A ship proudly flying American colors, heavily laden with goods destined for France, risked immediate capture by vigilant British cruisers or arbitrary seizure by predatory French privateers. Thus, the vast, once open seas, traditionally the undisputed domain of unfettered commerce, were transformed into a suffocating theater of profound frustration. American sailors valiantly risked their lives merely to reach a foreign port, and when capture inevitably occurred, the consequences were deeply personal and relentlessly brutal. But perhaps the most agonizing wound inflicted upon the American psyche was the abhorrent practice of impressment. For Americans, it was an egregious outrage that cut far deeper than the mere seizure of goods. British naval officers, disingenuously asserting that deserters from their fleet were lurking aboard American ships, forcibly conscripted sailors into their arduous service. American men, some born in Britain, many native-born in the United States, were cruelly torn from their decks and wrenched from their families. In heart-wrenching letters penned home to their wives and fathers, they recounted tales of sheer terror, debilitating exhaustion, and the profound betrayal of being reduced to mere pawns in the ruthless games of imperial ambition. Fishermen in quaint New England towns shuddered at the chilling prospect. The very sea that generously provided their livelihood also served as the unforgiving realm where foreign navies could snatch away their beloved kin. Fishermen and merchants, those sharing the same bustling ports, shared an even deeper, pervasive dread. The sea was no longer a safe haven. In the fervent heat of daily life, ordinary Americans observed these escalating affronts with unyielding anger. Coastal communities, seething with indignation, drafted furious petitions, urgently imploring Congress to take decisive action. Newspapers blared headlines suffused with righteous outrage, vehemently declaring, "British tyranny on the seas!" Patriotism and deep-seated resentment inextricably commingled in bustling barrooms and elegant drawing-rooms alike, as families meticulously rehearsed the harrowing tales of impressed relatives, of shuttered trade routes, and of imperiled livelihoods. Washington, too, grew increasingly restless. The nascent capital, with its naval stores still under construction, buzzed with official pages scurrying through corridors filled with fervent debates. George Washington himself, though in retirement, meticulously penned letters urging a cautious approach. But Thomas Jefferson, his successor, opted for a markedly different tack, optimistically hoping to leverage economic pressure rather than resorting to overt warfare. He signed the Embargo Act of 1807, a legislative gamble. In theory, severing all trade would strategically starve Britain into finally respecting American neutrality. In stark reality, it nearly brought the American economy to its knees. Ships lay idled in silent ports, businesses crumbled, and the embargoes themselves became reviled symbols of perceived federal overreach. Most damaging, perhaps, was the burgeoning sense among Americans that diplomacy was, in fact, failing them irrevocably. Each persistent British post on American soil, each arbitrarily seized ship, each forcibly conscripted sailor echoed the same undeniable story. The colossal empire that America had so recently defeated still loomed menacingly large. And the young republic, its government fragile, its institutions nascent, its unity precarious, appeared utterly powerless. Then entered men like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and the firebrand Warhawks. These young, dynamic leaders delivered a message that resonated powerfully in towns stretching from bustling Cincinnati to charming Charleston. The Republic unequivocally deserved respect. It deserved its own men on its own ships, goods shipped freely across the open seas, and lands liberated from Britain's lingering grasp. Their vision was robust, forward-looking, and brimming with unshakable confidence. It offered a compelling remedy for mounting frustration, direct confrontation, not timid retreat. Yet, for President James Madison, the choice was agonizingly difficult. He deeply believed in constitutional government and the prudent exercise of political restraint. He genuinely feared the immense cost of war, both in precious treasure and in human blood. Washington vividly remembered how narrowly victory had been achieved in 1781. But it had come at a truly exorbitant cost. Madison pondered. Could this fragile nation truly survive another war? Diplomats stationed in London diligently dispatched carefully worded protests. Envoys politely reminded the British Crown of existing treaties and their nation's rights to neutrality. But the British government, wholly preoccupied with Napoleon's relentless armies, remained impatiently dismissive. Its strategic imperative, the infamous Orders in Council, adamantly insisted on maintaining absolute control over neutral shipping. The British viewed these stringent rules as the very cornerstones of their maritime supremacy. The Americans, equally fervent in their convictions, perceived them as unprovoked acts of aggression. Slowly, the hopeful mist of peace began to dissipate. Peace had been deeply cherished, but it proved to be as inherently unstable as mist itself. In homes across the burgeoning republic, men and women silently bore the immense weight of decisions that were not yet theirs to make. Traders, sailors, and soldiers in waiting. It was as if the very heart of the nation palpitated with a silent, ominous drumbeat, warning of an impending storm. When Madison finally convened Congress in 1812, he delivered his address with carefully measured tones. He spoke eloquently of the accumulated wrongs, impressment, crippling trade restrictions, and insidious British alliances with hostile native tribes. He spoke of the sacred concept of national sovereignty. But beneath his carefully chosen words lay a heavier, undeniable truth. The Republic's patience had been utterly exhausted. America could no longer afford to be a passive observer in the ruthless games of empires. As winter gradually thawed into the gentle embrace of spring, the immense pressure continued to mount. American ports, once hushed, now hummed again. This time with the resonant, splintering sound of preparations for conflict. Men drilled diligently in dusty camps, ships creaked as they were meticulously fitted for war. And the congressional debates crackled with an electric energy. The Warhawks relentlessly pressed for immediate action, while the Federalists pleaded for a cautious restraint. Then came June 1812, and the fateful moment of irreversible decision. With votes meticulously tallied, resolutions passionately passed, and history poised precariously on a blade's edge, Congress formally declared war. The line had been crossed, the die unequivocally cast. And as the ink dried on the solemn declaration, the simmering current of frustration swelled into an unstoppable flood. A nation prepared, with grim determination, to defend itself, come what may. But before the thunder of cannons, before the first tragic shots were fired, we begin here. We stand at the very end of that fragile peace. The peace that was so optimistically given, so desperately hoped for, and that ultimately shattered beneath the immense weight of pride, unyielding principle, and the devastating human cost of empire. As dawn broke over a nation comprising 13 states, now sprawling from the coast to the Mississippi, America's audacious experiment in republican government was about to embark upon a harrowing new chapter. The Revolution's unfulfilled promise of economic justice and true sovereignty would be tested once more. For the fragile peace of 1783 had irrevocably vanished, and from its tumultuous remnants arose the fierce conflict of 1812, born of fervent conviction, unbridled human ambition, and the relentless, ceaseless currents of history. Chapter 2. Troubled waters, trade wars, and naval dominance. The vast, boundless ocean was never intended to be a battlefield. Yet, by the early 1800s, the turbulent Atlantic waves had inexorably transformed into a theater of escalating tensions between mighty empires. Projects of immense wealth, unyielding pride, and raw power collided violently in the salt-scented breeze. As Britain and France relentlessly waged their monumental struggle during the Napoleonic Wars, the nascent American merchant fleet found itself unceremoniously caught in a maelstrom not of its own making, carrying its fervent hopes and its cherished freedoms across waters bristling with unseen dangers. From the bustling deck of an American merchant vessel, the sea appeared utterly limitless. A boundless expanse pregnant with possibility, heavily laden with tobacco, cotton, timber, and furs. Each vessel powerfully symbolized the promise of burgeoning prosperity for a nation still in its tender infancy. Cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York, their thriving ports pulsating with unbridled ambition, relied heavily on the ocean's generous bounty. But this cherished freedom of the sea was rapidly becoming perilously restricted. The British, fiercely determined to suffocate their French adversary, extended a suffocating naval blockade across the entire Atlantic, irrevocably transforming once lucrative trade routes into agonizing gauntlets of unrelenting risk. In 1807, Britain unilaterally issued its first infamous order in council, imperiously decreeing that neutral ships bound for French ports must first, and without exception, dock in British harbors, submit to intrusive inspections, and pay onerous duties. Any captain who dared to refuse risked immediate seizure. For American captains, this was tantamount to outright piracy, albeit by a different name, a blatant violation of neutral rights and a direct, unmitigated affront to their national sovereignty. Yet, for the British, this was deemed an absolute wartime necessity, to strategically starve France into abject submission by ruthlessly choking off its vital commerce across the ocean. Napoleon, in a swift and retaliatory move, responded in kind. The Berlin and Milan decrees stipulated that any vessel complying with British blockades was unequivocally fair prey for French seizure. Thus, any American ship proudly flying the stars and stripes, optimistically hoping to gracefully thread its way between these warring giants, found itself inextricably entrapped. Neutrality, in this brutal new reality, meant only risk. Peril was utterly inescapable. Seafarers were caught in a tightening, suffocating noose. Every single voyage risked immediate interception. Every cargo run flirted dangerously with outright confiscation. Yet, American crews, driven by unyielding contract and desperate need, resolutely pressed on. In quaint port villages from bustling Boston to charming Savannah, children waved wistfully to departing ships. Mothers pressed cherished talismans into their sons' salty hands, while fathers whispered fervent prayers into the ceaseless wind. These brave men embarked on perilous journeys that could either bring substantial reward or lead to agonizing detainment, or far worse. Harrowing stories rapidly spread, of vessels ruthlessly seized, of ships brazenly commandeered in broad daylight, of sailors unjustly taken prisoner, and of precious cargoes illicitly sold at foreign auctions. The people felt the searing sting not merely in the tangible loss of goods, but in their profoundly wounded national pride. Editors of outspoken newspapers vehemently cried, "Tyranny!" decrying British injustice and the oppression of free trade. Their impassioned words further stoked the simmering embers of American resentment. But the true terror emanated not from the mere seizure of goods alone. It lay in the utterly harrowing Chesapeake Leopard affair of June 1807, just off the sun-drenched coast of Virginia. The American frigate USS Chesapeake was meticulously preparing for sea when the rogue British ship HMS Leopard menacingly hove into view. Officers aboard the Leopard imperiously demanded the right to search for alleged British deserters. The Chesapeake's intrepid commander, James Barron, unequivocally refused. Guns roared. The Leopard opened fire, and in mere minutes, 3 American sailors lay tragically dead, and 18 more were grievously wounded. British sailors then unceremoniously boarded the Chesapeake and forcibly impressed 4 men into their service. 3 were alleged British subjects, 1 was undeniably an American citizen. The exploding outrage across America was fierce and visceral. Not only had brutal violence been inflicted upon a ship proudly flying the American flag, but the egregious deed had occurred in unambiguous, sovereign waters. There was no justifiable explanation, no semblance of apology, just raw, humiliating, unadulterated force. Across taverns and drawing rooms, the event immediately became a fervent rallying cry. Mothers wept openly before portraits of their sons. Street corner speakers passionately demanded immediate retaliation. Weekly newspapers widely reprinted chilling lithographs of the damaged Chesapeake's tattered rigging, the silent, eloquent testimony of broken timbers. Few could fail to recognize a nation being brazenly denied its fundamental dignity. If peace had once been a viable option, it irrevocably faded in the tumultuous wake of that outrage. President Thomas Jefferson, fiercely determined to avert a full-scale war, attempted a novel strategy. He imposed a sweeping embargo on all American exports to foreign ports. The underlying idea was deceptively simple: if England and France were deprived of vital American goods, perhaps they would be compelled to acknowledge U.S. rights. But the embargo, instead, spectacularly backfired. American trade plummeted into collapse, coastal towns languished in economic stagnation, and bustling shipyards lay dormant. Farmers and manufacturers alike found their traditional markets vanished, and a rampant black market swiftly emerged. The very spirit of American resistance curdled into a near-palpable hatred for the restrictive law itself. The American economy sputtered and gasped, as the embargo brutally strangled its very lungs. Jefferson's optimistic dream of neutrality was stillborn under the immense weight of economic collapse. The silence where ships once gracefully departed ports became deafening and oppressive. Anger shifted from foreign oppression to domestic failings. Americans began clamoring vociferously for a return to assertiveness, an outlet to channel their collective pain into a unified purpose. Meanwhile, the relentless British blockade grew steadily stronger. Naval vessels mercilessly patrolled the American coast, arbitrarily stopping ships under vague suspicions. Even neutral cargoes bound for seemingly neutral harbors were seized without recourse. The legality of such actions mattered little when British guns possessed the immediate power to sink a vessel in minutes, or forcibly drag innocent sailors from their posts. The sea had become a terrifying place of dread, rather than a boundless realm of promise. But the American spirit, with each successive injustice on the waves, profoundly shifted. The call for immediate retaliation swelled to a crescendo. It was no longer merely diplomatic protest that stoked the raging fires of rhetoric. It was anger made deeply, agonizingly personal. The father laid to rest, the son unjustly impressed, the precious cargo sold off in foreign auctions as if it were declared enemy contraband. Everywhere, a vindictive energy spurred a growing, unshakable determination to take decisive action, to fiercely defend American rights, and perhaps, to teach Britain a profound and lasting lesson on the open sea. Though there were modest victories, fleeting occasions of pride that instilled a new kind of faith in the unsettled republic. The young U.S. Navy, despite its modest size and chronic underfunding, had begun to make its formidable voice heard. Captains like Isaac Hull and Joshua Barney eagerly sought opportune moments to challenge British supremacy. On August 19, 1812, the USS Constitution boldly met HMS Guerriere off the sun-drenched coast of Nova Scotia. In a furious, thunderous exchange of cannon fire, the Constitution brilliantly outmaneuvered the British frigate. When the acrid smoke finally cleared, she majestically sailed away victorious. News of the triumph traveled swiftly, igniting a wave of elation. Americans cheered, and the ship, already affectionately dubbed Old Ironsides, because her sturdy sides seemed to miraculously repel British cannonballs, became a living, breathing emblem of defiance. A single victory off Halifax, blindingly small in the grand scale of ages, struck a profound chord of national pride. These early maritime victories, however limited in scope, powerfully revealed the emerging identity of an American seafaring nation, courageous, relentless, and utterly unafraid to challenge the immense weight of empire. They offered flashpoints of optimism, but they did not fundamentally alter the broader, grim reality. The British naval blockade tightened like an unforgiving vice. Diplomatic appeals continued to fall on deaf ears, and trade still suffered crippling blows. Tensions rippled through the very bloodstream of the nation. In bustling taverns and on grimy docks, sailors shared their harrowing tales of escape and valiant resistance. Fishermen in Maine wistfully recalled their navy's rare but stunning victories. In Boston, shipwrights who had bravely survived the embargo spoke of a renewed sense of purpose, repairing hulls, hammering new keels, and meticulously preparing ships for a conflict that many now expected was utterly inevitable. Washington, too, hummed with a palpable anticipation. Ships docked at the Navy Yard received new fittings, gunpowder barrels were meticulously counted and inventoried, and training camps began to burgeon in the hinterland. Every single cabinet discussion revolved around the same agonizing choice: how much longer could America withstand this relentless maritime barrage? Was another revolution a possibility? Or could this young republic somehow absorb the immense cost? By early 1812, as spring began to gently soften winter's harsh edge, the pervasive, simmering tension hovering offshore inexorably drained into the national consciousness. The seas had delivered a series of unbearably humiliating insults against American sovereignty. Encroachments once grudgingly tolerated in the name of peace were now unequivocally perceived as existential violations. The very silence of the ocean, once conducive to bustling commerce, now seemed ominously dangerous, each wave seemingly whispering a harrowing story of stolen goods, forcibly conscripted hands, and shattered promises. The story of trouble on the seas is the very first wave in this unfolding, cataclysmic war. It is a poignant tale of power and unwavering principle, of merchants cruelly torn from their livelihoods, of sailors brutally dragged into foreign service, and of a people who fiercely believed their flag should mean far more than a mere wish. It should unequivocally mean respect. As we close this chapter, we witness a nation painstakingly gathering its collective will, forging its unshakable resolve upon the fundamental question of whether maritime freedom is truly worth a declaration of full-scale war. In the ensuing chapters, we will cross that indelible line, transitioning from quiet rage into open, brutal conflict, from the coast to the untamed frontier, from Chesapeake to the Great Lakes, from the vast, open sea to the rolling fields of Canada. But here, on the trembling edge of revolt, we remember, the sea is more than mere water. It is sacred rights, unyielding pride, and an unfolding fate. And the young republic? Under relentless waves of outrage and burgeoning resolve, meticulously prepares to declare its inherent worth. Chapter 3: Impressment. Stolen sailors and national rage. The chilling caress of the northern wind carried a familiar, insidious dread across America's coastal towns. It was an invisible, pervasive threat, drifting in menacingly from the vast, open sea. It was called impressment, and to ordinary Americans, it was far more than a mere policy. It was a living, breathing horror, a brazen theft of identity and fundamental freedom, brazenly carried out in broad daylight on the high seas. Families, entire communities, and indeed the very nation itself, each felt the searing sting of this injustice, each grappling with the agonizing question: could this young republic truly stand tall while its sons were ruthlessly seized and forcibly conscripted to serve a foreign king? Impressment was the Royal Navy's brutal and desperate answer to its chronic, insatiable shortage of sailors. In an empire sprawling across the entire globe, Britain constantly required an immense, inexhaustible supply of manpower. Voluntary enlistment could never hope to adequately fill its vast, ever-expanding armadas. The solution, they firmly believed, lay in forcibly taking men, any men, found on vessels of any flag, shamelessly claiming them as British subjects or alleged deserters. In brutal practice, this meant that American citizens were summarily ripped from their own decks, violently thrown into foreign service, and forced to fight in a war that was profoundly not their own. To truly grasp the immense weight of this outrage, picture a serene, quiet morning in Boston. A schooner, her hull robust, meticulously loads barrels of rum and cod. A crew of 10 men, rugged and deeply sunburned, share hearty laughs as they meticulously secure the sails. The ship's name is proudly painted on its bow, on its stern, the stars and stripes flutter gently. These men are undeniably Americans, a farmer's son, a fisherman's apprentice, a grizzled veteran of the Revolution. Not one of them suspects that by dusk, their lives could be irrevocably torn apart. And yet, it happened, with horrifying regularity, across the expansive Atlantic. The wind carries British cruisers, predatory and watchful, as they relentlessly patrol neutral waters. They hailed the schooner, imperiously demanding to board. The crew, bewildered and defiant, resists. They have broken no British laws. But the British captains have their immutable orders. Seize anyone suspected of being British. There is no ceremony, no pretense of justice. Men are brutally dragged below decks, bound in unforgiving chains, and condemned to years of grueling service on foreign ships. The schooner sails on, a ghostly silhouette, tragically missing its crew. The empty seats at the tavern table that night tell a quiet, yet devastating story, one of unmitigated loss and pervasive fear. One of the most searing examples, an event that ignited a nation, was the Chesapeake Leopard encounter on June 22, 1807. The British warship HMS Leopard brazenly intercepted the American frigate USS Chesapeake off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. The Chesapeake's captain, James Barron, steadfastly refused a search. The Leopard, without hesitation, opened fire. Cannons roared, and in mere minutes, 3 Americans lay dead, while 18 more were grievously maimed. Then, the British boarded, seizing 4 men. Their actions, legal by their own British standards, were, to Americans, an act of sacrilege. Accounts from that time burn with indignation. Mary Lloyd, the distraught wife of one impressed sailor, stood at dawn on a crowded pier, her heart an open wound. Her husband's face was the last she saw before British sailors brutally dragged him aboard. She watched in horror as the ship pulled away, his anguished cries swallowed by the wind. Was he a deserter? A British subject? Or merely an American whose only crime was sailing for freedom? No one knew. But what everyone felt was unbridled rage and profound helplessness. Letters penned home by impressed American sailors painted grim, harrowing scenes. Quivering from cold on unforgiving British decks, they were forcibly made to scrub floors, scale towering masts, and fire cannons under the constant threat of flogging or death. Some recounted being told to renounce their American citizenship or face severe punishment. Many, with admirable defiance, refused. Chains and brutal treatment became their daily fare. Their captors would sometimes mix them among British crew for months, even years, until they succumbed to death or miraculously escaped. Families back in Boston or Charleston waited, tormented by uncertainty, perpetually hopeful, and then, inevitably, resigned when their loved ones never returned. Newspapers exploded with unbridled outrage. Editors graphically described the scene. "Our flag insulted! Our citizens plundered!" Petitions poured into Congress from every corner of the nation. Town meetings passed resolutions demanding immediate action. America watched, holding its breath, anxiously waiting for its government to respond, and wondering if it possessed the necessary power to do more than simply protest. To have one's countrymen stripped from American ships in peacetime felt like an unforgivable betrayal of the Revolution's sacred promise of liberty. Still, diplomacy initially took precedence. President Thomas Jefferson, and later President James Madison, lodged formal protests. Envoys meticulously wrote letters, delivered stern notes, and issued ultimatums. British officials, with customary politeness, responded with echoes of justification, asserting that British subjects would be reclaimed even if they had traveled under another flag. In their cold calculus, London ministers rationalized that the very survival of the empire rested on unyielding naval strength. Lives lost or taken were tragically seen as acceptable collateral damage. For President Madison, the situation was utterly intolerable. He viewed the blatant theft of Americans as a profound violation of sovereignty, an unforgivable assault on national dignity. Yet, he also keenly understood the inherent military weakness of the United States. A war with Britain would come at an exorbitant cost: lives, money, and the nation's fragile stability. But as each letter arrived, clutched in an American woman's trembling hand, as each child gazed with ragged longing into a silent horizon, those costs became tragically, agonizingly personal. To ordinary citizens, this was more than distant news. It was an open, festering wound. Parents were consumed by fear for their sons, wives haunted by the crushing silence, and entire communities wrecked by the agonizing doubt of where their neighbors had simply vanished. Sailors, demoralized and terrified, refused to man the merchant ships, and America's maritime lifeblood began to turn feeble under the relentless pressure of British steel. The stolen sailors were not abstract concepts, they were fathers, husbands, friends. And each stolen man carried with him a spark of national feeling that could not be extinguished. By 1810, this pervasive sense of grievance had reached into the very core of American identity. "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," became a frequently repeated refrain in Congress. The language used was vivid, the sentiment fiercely resolute. Americans firmly believed they had paid enough with their hard-won freedom and their shed blood. Now, demands for respect resonated as loudly as the newly mounted cannons along the docks. Madison assembled Congress. The time for mere protests had long passed. The impassioned calls for more assertive measures, embargoes, milder retaliation, no longer sufficed. But still, impressment defiantly continued. It was a federal crime against America's sacred freedom of the seas. No sailor felt truly safe, even ships that sailed under false names, carrying forged documentation, could not escape the impenetrable cordon of British cruisers. American flags alone no longer signaled neutrality in the eyes of the British Navy. They meant nothing at all. In private diaries, American sailors penned entries filled with utter desperation. "I am a slave," one former merchant marine wrote in 1811, "of another kingdom whose wars I do not wage, whose king I do not serve." The profound bitterness of these words stemmed from deep personal loss, of safety, of identity, of fundamental choice. They sowed seeds of defiance in America's maritime communities, a palpable readiness to resist, even at the terrible risk of war. In towns like Salem and Charleston, communities passed resolutions vehemently demanding retribution. In Congress, voices like Henry Clay's thundered, "Our dignity! Our flag! Our men! Each are assaulted! We must act!" The warhawks pressed their case relentlessly. peaceful measures had demonstrably failed. The nation was under attack, not by shouts across the frontier, but by the slow, grinding theft of its sovereignty on the sea. Then, in March 1812, Madison sent a message to Congress outlining an extraordinary proposal. He recommended measures short of war, general embargoes, naval expansion, and economic retaliation. He knew war loomed, but he demanded a last stand for dignity. Congress approved the rechartering of the Navy, bolstered coastal defenses, and funded new frigates. They empowered the president to enact selective trade bans. The stolen sailors had sparked an irreversible change. America would no longer be a silent victim. Still, the stolen sailors remained tragically missing. Their faces haunted tavern walls, etched forever in countless hearts. The list of names grew: Thomas Leonard, pressed in 1810, Samuel Hawks, seized in 1811, James Riley, torn from his ship in 1812. Their stories became tales of martyrdom, sacrifices that profoundly strengthened national resolve. Finally, by June 1812, the political tide had decisively shifted. Congress voted for war. Madison signed the Declaration. The die was cast. A young nation, still fragile, still deeply divided, had drawn its unwavering line. Its citizens, its flag, its honor would no longer be taken by force. Impressment, that terrible practice, to have stolen souls, was more than a mere injustice. It was a moment of profound reckoning. The violation of individuals moved the entire nation. The sorrow of families, the unbridled outrage in town squares. The courage of those who still frowned at British salt water yet bravely sailed on. That was the crucible that forged this war. But once the war began, would those stolen sailors be remembered? Would they be redeemed, avenged, or would they be tragically swallowed by history's relentless currents, like so many wooden ships beneath the unforgiving waves? Soon the answer would come. In the form of battle reports, in the relentless struggle for the Great Lakes and rivers, in the thunder of Alabama pistols. But in this precise moment, on the very eve of war, one thing was crystal clear: the blatant theft of American lives, the agonizing wounding of a nation's very soul, had definitively ended the fragile peace and propelled the Republic into full-scale war. The stolen sailors may have been lost to the grim British decks, but their spirit returned home. Vibrant and unyielding, in the hearts of a united and enraged people. Chapter 4: Native Resistance and British Influence in the West. The western frontier was a world unto itself, wild, vast, and fiercely contested. For centuries, indigenous nations had lived in complex harmony and intermittent conflict across these expansive lands, meticulously weaving a rich tapestry of culture, intricate diplomacy, and intermittent warfare. But as American settlers relentlessly pressed westward after 1783, they quickly discovered that the territory was neither empty nor welcoming. It was, in fact, ancestral native land, fiercely defended by proud nations absolutely determined to resist any form of invasion. In the early 1800s, these indigenous nations encountered a formidable, albeit opportunistic, ally, the British. Although Britain had lost its 13 colonies, it stubbornly retained a strategic interest in North America. Along the Great Lakes, their remaining forts, Niagara, Detroit, Michilimackinac, loomed menacingly on the frontier like silent, watchful sentinels. British agents and astute traders diligently maintained diplomatic and economic ties with native tribes, who, in turn, found in them a crucial counterweight to unrelenting American expansionism. This complex relationship, born of mutual necessity and intricate negotiation, would inevitably become a devastating flashpoint in the burgeoning War of 1812. Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader of commanding presence, grasped the mounting threat with profound clarity and urgent foresight. Tall, dignified, and undeniably charismatic, he spoke with a voice that carried the immense weight of generations, yet simultaneously kindled a fervent hope for a future where native peoples could stand united, preserving their autonomy against relentless American encroachment. Tecumseh firmly believed that only a grand confederation, A truly united front of tribes stretching from the vast Great Lakes to the distant Gulf of Mexico could safeguard native lands, cherished cultures, and their inherent autonomy. Alone, each tribe risked isolation and inevitable defeat. United, they might stand firm and unyielding. Alongside him stood his brother, Tenskwatawa, revered as the Prophet. His vision was profoundly spiritual, a return to ancestral ways, a steadfast rejection of alcohol and European goods, and a powerful revival of indigenous identity. Together, they imbued their burgeoning movement with both profound political purpose and sacred conviction, inspiring a deep wellspring of resilience in villages that had endured unimaginable loss, devastating disease, and relentless displacement. Yet, no alliance can truly survive without sustained support. Native diplomacy naturally converged with strategic British interests. British agents readily provided firearms and ammunition, and they actively facilitated trade, which, in turn, significantly strengthened native economies. Simultaneously, Great Britain gained a crucial edge, a formidable network of allies who could effectively impede American troop movements and expanding settlements from the east. Moral currents thus intricately intertwined with imperial strategy, and the western frontier transformed into a volatile crucible, where competing ambitions violently clashed. In settlements like Vincennes and Fort Wayne, ambushes and skirmishes became frequent, stark reflections of deeper, simmering tensions. Families barricaded their doors. Fathers grimly took up muskets, and travelers whispered fearfully of pervasive danger on the winding forest trails. The very land itself seemed to tremble under the immense strain. Formal declarations of war were seldom heard on the frontier, yet the relentless violence spoke volumes. When American forces brutally struck Prophetstown in 1811, the spiritual heart of Tecumseh's alliance, they anticipated a swift and decisive victory. Instead, they found villages ablaze, symbols shattered, but spirits utterly unbroken. The devastation, while confirming American strength, also reaffirmed the unyielding will of native leaders to steadfastly resist. Tecumseh, though deeply wounded by loss, persevered with unshakable determination. He traveled tirelessly from tribe to tribe, his resonant voice echoing powerfully across councils of elders and warriors. "The ground we stand on is ours," he vehemently declared. "It feeds us. It shelters us, and we will not surrender it." His commanding presence galvanized widespread support. Miami, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Winnebago nations, names that would reverberate through every treaty and battle yet to come. All the while, British forces watched intently. They perceived in Tecumseh's burgeoning alliance a golden opportunity to check American momentum. Inside Ottawa and Quebec, British commanders authorized arms shipments to native bands. Agents meticulously mapped settler trails, diligently noted army readiness levels, and meticulously prepared for inevitable escalation. With each fusillade that pierced the forest gloom, British and native ambitions inextricably merged. America responded with growing impatience. To Washington, the frontier represented manifest destiny in unstoppable motion. Democracy was expanding outward, and British meddling was an insufferable affront. The Warhawks, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, vociferously denounced native resistance as a crime of direct British instigation. They called for immediate retaliation, for the opening of new battlefronts along the Great Lakes and rivers flowing westward. And so, soldiers marched into contested territory, regulars alongside militia, white uniforms stark against the green camouflage of the forest. Log cabins, once safe havens, were hastily transformed into fortresses. Scouts moved quietly beneath the dense canopies, listening, waiting for telltale smoke or the faint sound of footsteps. Ambush was an ever-present reality. The war was deeply personal. Yet, in every skirmish, the native presence was more than mere anger. It was intricate strategy. Their intimate knowledge of rivers and ridges told their story, waves of disciplined musket fire erupting through swamp mist. Precise flanking movements executed through dense foliage, that was their refined technique. They were defenders, intimately familiar with the subtle sounds of forest life. With sacred trails far older than any European nation, Prophetstown, though brutally broken, was not destroyed in spirit. Settlements, though dispersed, saw new embers of resistance carried on the wind. Gatherings were held in hidden groves, prayers to the ancestors drifted up around campfires at night. The prophet and Tecumseh continued to speak of unwavering resistance, even as American soldiers advanced upon Detroit and Fort Harrison. Detroit fell, yet not without the costly loss of tens of lives behind its walls. Fort Harrison was besieged, though it tenaciously held. Every westward footprint was hampered by resolute resistance. It was not British might that slowed American progress, but unyielding native resolve, nurtured by profound ancestral ties and armed by imperial friends. Britain, in turn, escalated its support. Fur traders became crucial couriers. Fort provisions arrived alongside revolvers. British regiments stationed near the frontier utilized indigenous scouts to guide their sorties. Military correspondence reveals cautious approval. The alliance was effective, but it had to be carefully managed. Britain would not openly declare war through native fire, but it would not restrain its partners. The frontier blurred the lines. Was the war Anglo-American, or was it also fundamentally indigenous? Perhaps the most truthful answer was both. The dark shadow of empire and the intense agony of native defense merged in the dense forest, in the winding river valleys, and in the very souls of those whose homelands rang with the chilling sound of musket fire and drumbeats. But the alliance had its inherent vulnerabilities. Tecumseh's grand vision required unity across diverse nations, each with its own distinct differences, complex histories, and lingering wounds. Not all chiefs agreed. Some feared devastating retaliation, others resented British priorities. Internal disagreements and the relentless assaults by settlers and troops relentlessly fractured cohesion. Still, Tecumseh persisted undeterred. On journeys through Mississippi lands, he renewed pledges. At Hawks' calls, he sealed crucial alliances. At river crossings, he left behind timber stakes and ominous warning signs. His great, unending struggle was to hold together a scattered people amidst intensifying settlement. The violence expanded. Tippecanoe in 1811 witnessed American militia clashing fiercely with native warriors loyal to Tecumseh. The prophet himself stood valiantly alongside his people, though he could not hold the line. The battle ended in a desperate retreat. Prophetstown fell. The shock reverberated throughout native lands, but Tecumseh, his courage undimmed, mourned not for his city, but for lost opportunity. Yet, he continued onward. To British generals and fur traders, he became an essential ally. To American opponents, a man to be stopped at all costs. When the War of 1812 was formally declared in June, the frontier immediately became a principal theater. American command anticipated swift action, clear the land of British influence and native aggression. But the land itself fiercely resisted them. Forest, marsh, river, ridge, each made assault costly, each slowed the promise of unstoppable expansion. Along the Thames in 1813, the confrontation culminated. Tecumseh and his warriors, British regulars, and militia gathered amidst the vibrant autumn colors. Musket fire illuminated the dawn. The battle was fierce, fluid, and brutally decisive. Yet Tecumseh led from the front until he fell, a mortal wound that irrevocably deflated his confederation. In that tragic moment, the alliance began to unravel. British presence retreated from frontier towns. Reservations and treaties replaced grand confederations. American settlement poured in, tapping fertile valleys and rivers, forever changing the Northwest Territory, shaped by lives lost and promises broken. The war in the West did not end with Tecumseh's death, but the dream of unified native resistance did. The frontier became open ground, shaped by treaties that overwhelmingly favored settlers, by tribes displaced or absorbed, and by promises never kept. In the end, the story of native resistance is one of relentless struggle, profound dignity, and heartbreaking loss. Tecumseh's alliance remains an enduring emblem of indigenous resilience, a powerful assertion of sovereignty in the face of overwhelming pressure. British support was critical, but not ultimately decisive, without the inherent will to preserve their lands. Native nations would have had little with which to resist. With it, they carved a poignant moment of defiance. As the war continued, the memory of those campaigns lingered. Treaty negotiations in Ghent would mention indigenous land, but only as bargaining chips, never as equal parties. The stories of warriors, of burned villages, of displaced lives, those passed into tribal memory, into songs, into oral histories. When the frontier finally fell silent, the land had fundamentally changed. The echoes of rifle fire returned to the gentle calls of birds. The villages were gone, but the forts remained. The tide of settlement surged westward, built on the memorials of lives lost in bitter conflict. But the chapter of native resistance shaped the war and profoundly shaped the nation's conscience. Even if it was soon to be conveniently forgotten, the alliance with Britain created a fleeting hope. The deaths at the Thames turned that hope tragic. And in the end, both power and pride were irrevocably lost. The western frontier, once alive with hope and fierce resistance, now lay open, fields cleared, towns rising. The canvas of North America had changed. But the silence across the land carried memory, grief, and enduring testimony to those who had fought for their homes. Tecumseh walks the paths of legend now, his words spoken at council, his deeds retold by elders. His alliance, though brief, remains a powerful lesson in unity and tragic loss. The frontier, once contested, became the foundations for a nation. But the blood and promise of native resistance echo beneath its plains. And for those who listen, the story is far from over. Chapter 5: Rise of the Warhawks. Voices for War in Washington. The hallowed halls of Congress reverberated with a distinctly new kind of energy in the winter of 1811, an energy far fiercer than any debate on debt or agriculture. It was a potent cocktail of ambition, profound pride, and righteous indignation, seamlessly merged with the impassioned voices of young men utterly determined to shape a nascent nation's destiny. They proudly dubbed themselves Warhawks, and their simple, yet electrifying, message resonated with urgency. America must stand up. America must defend itself. America must go to war. Henry Clay of Kentucky emerged as their most formidable voice. Tall, charismatically eloquent beyond his years, Clay spoke of honor as if it were tangible flesh and bone. His gravelly voice imbued with profound conviction. The British acts of impressment, the suffocating blockade, and the insidious alliance with hostile native tribes were not mere grievances. They were unforgivable insults to the very soul of the Republic. "The mace is broken, our flag insulted," Clay thundered across the chamber. "And now we must show the world we are no longer content to bow." Opposite him stood John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, equally fiery yet more restrained in his delivery. Calhoun spoke of fundamental principles, neutral rights, maritime freedom, national integrity. He warned that the Republic's resolve would be tested not merely by petitions or protests, but by its intrinsic moral strength. "We must act," he declared, "not only because they frighten our sailors, they frighten our spirit." These were young men, no older than their nation's earliest patriots. Many were veterans of the Revolution's living memory, sons of its heroes, inheritors of its potent mythology. Their sense of destiny was palpable and powerful. They fervently believed America's moment had arrived, to claim a resonant voice in the councils of nations, to unequivocally defend its sailors, and to decisively wrest control of its own shores. But what truly drove these warhawks? Their voices carried more than mere bravado. For men who represented the rugged frontier communities. From Ohio's dense forests to Tennessee's winding rivers, the war was profoundly personal. Families had been subjected to brutal raids, homes tragically burned, crops trampled underfoot. Native resistance, often armed by cunning British agents, was no abstract concept. It was raw, immediate pain, a pervasive, chilling fear. These politicians were not aloof aristocrats droning in distant halls. They were kin to the settler families whose lives had been utterly laid waste. In one particularly powerful speech, Clay vividly recalled walking the banks of the Ohio River, the earth stained red with settlers' blood. He spoke of hearing the harrowing tales of ambush and kin tragically carried away into the dark woods. As he described the riverbank's silent stones, each a tribute to someone lost. The chamber fell into a hushed silence, the young man's eyes shining beneath the flickering candlelight. The Warhawks also keenly understood that America desperately needed symbols, victories, declarations, unwavering fortitude to define its nascent identity. They were not content with mere moral outrage. They demanded decisive action. Resolutions piled up in committee rooms. Embargoes were tightened, navies strengthened, declarations meticulously drafted. They urgently pressed for the construction of new warships, 18-gun brigs, heavy frigates, corvettes, all meticulously built to challenge British ships on the waves. They demanded volunteers, they demanded unyielding resolve. Their fiery rhetoric terrified their opponents, Federalists. Deeply rooted in New England's mercantile classes, warned with grim solemnity. War threatens commerce, credit, prosperity. But their earnest pleas fell on ears that heard only the thunder of British cannons against American merchantmen. Everywhere, the potent voices of the Warhawks drowned out any semblance of caution. Their arguments were elegantly simple. America deserved respect, its fundamental rights, and a prominent place on the world stage. They declared, "Diplomacy has failed." The tempo of Congress dramatically changed. Debates, once long and rambling, became taut and sharp. Questions of maritime law gave way to urgent arguments about cannon diameter, troop strength, and frontier fortifications. Evening sessions frequently ended with the drafting of resolutions that this House on due consideration recommends war. Yet, the Warhawks also recognized the immense human cost. Henry Clay visited the new forts being hastily constructed in Ohio. He spoke to young volunteers, many barefoot and bright-eyed, who did not yet comprehend the hardships they would endure. He gently placed a hand on their shoulders and solemnly reminded them of sacrifice, of their parents' sacrifice, of the blood that had birthed the Republic. He spoke passionately of fighting for their children's children, of a victory that would, one day, echo in their grandfathers' tales. Their call was not hollow. Orphans and widows joined fervent prayer meetings for soldiers. Ministers preached of righteous war, quoting Latin phrases about the rights of man and drawing powerful examples from ancient Greece and Rome. The nation, though deeply divided, was gradually becoming united in anticipation. America had discovered its cause, not merely to be free, but to be strong. Even as the Warhawks' voices rose to a crescendo, President Madison listened intently. He remained cautious, still acutely aware of the immense weight of war. But he could no longer ignore the nation's palpable mood. Clay's speeches, widely quoted in newspapers across Virginia and Kentucky, possessed a power Madison could not deny. The Warhawks were, in essence, defining America's collective will. And so, June approached. Final resolutions were delivered, votes were meticulously taken. The chamber, encompassing Warhawks, Federalists, and seasoned veterans, lined up. The tally was close, yet ultimately decisive. A formal declaration would soon follow. Soon. America would no longer endure quietly, not in word, not in deed. From Washington to the distant frontier settlements, towns absorbed the news. Church bells pealed, ports flew flags. Drums beat rhythmically in training grounds. War, once a distant rumor, was about to become a stark question of life and death. By the dawn of June 18, 1812, the Warhawks had accomplished more than simply rallying Congress. They had rallied an entire nation. Their voices had carried fear, memory, and unwavering resolve across plantations, farms, forests, and merchant docks. Their war was not born of bloodlust, it was born of profound resistance, of unyielding pride, of the collective will to definitively define America's place in a world where empires spoke loudly and with impunity. The Warhawks were not mere warriors, they were visionary. They perceived in war a profound possibility of national unity, of true sovereignty, of a republic transitioning from the defensive to the commanding. In their impassioned speeches, America transcended being a mere collection of states, it became a sacred cause. And so, the Warhawks spoke history into being, not by cavalry charge, but by fervent argument and righteous indignation. The nation listened, and as the final votes were counted, one overarching question remained: would those words, meticulously forged in candlelight, withstand the raging fires of war? Would the dream of Republican dignity truly survive the crucible of battle? In that precise moment, the young Republic paused, holding its collective breath. The Warhawks had raised their voices. The nation had unequivocally answered. Tomorrow, the declaration would be formally drawn, but tonight, the Republic listened. Feeling each powerful echo of the Warhawks' cry reverberating off marble columns and wooden pews, across silent farms and restless cities. War was coming, and the voices that imbued it with meaning had been undeniably heard. Chapter 6: James Madison's Dilemma, Diplomacy or War? James Madison sat at his writing desk in the presidential residence. Quill in hand, a deep furrow etched between his brows. The year was 1812, and the immense weight of history pressed heavily upon him. Before him lay heart-wrenching letters from distraught mothers, impassioned petitions from traders utterly ruined by arbitrary British seizures, and the fiery speeches of fervent congressmen clamoring for immediate war. And yet, just beyond his window, the placid Potomac River flowed on in its steady, unassuming course, as if time itself demanded calm rather than tumultuous conflict. Madison was not a man given to impulse. He had meticulously shaped the Constitution. He had tirelessly worked to forge a republic meticulously built on the bedrock of reason and judicious restraint. He believed profoundly in the power of diplomacy, in the careful and nuanced exercise of statecraft. But with each British ship that brazenly seized an American vessel, each innocent sailor forcibly impressed into service, each native raid supported by hostile forces from Canada, diplomacy began to feel like a cracked, thin sheet of ice, dangerously unstable and utterly insufficient. In the winter of 1811, he convened his cabinet, a circle of earnest faces gathered around a low, flickering fire. They spoke in measured tones of solemn treaties, crippling embargoes, and unwavering refusals. Their arguments were sober and pragmatic. We warn, we argue, we wait. But Madison's heart weighed differently. He heard every clamor for justice, saw every torn letter from sailors' families, and felt the pulsing beat of a nation growing dangerously impatient. Whose voice was he to silence? Whose pain was he to ignore? That spring, Madison dispatched envoys across the Atlantic to London to deliver formal protests against impressment and the relentless interference with trade. But weeks stretched into agonizing months before any replies condescendingly arrived. British officials, fully engrossed in the whirlwind of Napoleonic ambitions, scarcely paid heed. The infamous Orders in Council remained defiantly intact. British forts stubbornly remained on American soil. The Royal Navy continued to stop and board American ships at will. At home, true leadership meant bearing both the torch and the immense burden, igniting the moment to act while simultaneously carrying the immense cost of inevitable consequences. Inside his study, he meticulously drafted the language. He would indeed recommend war, but not lightly. He carefully spelled out the grievances, impressment, the crippling blockade, the blatant violation of treaties, British support for hostile native attacks. He appealed to Congress to carefully weigh risk against unyielding principle. He stated, "If Britain persists, if our sailors cannot sail free, if our national sovereignty is denied, we must defend those rights. We must stand for what we are." On June 1, 1812, Madison delivered his address. His voice was steady, though his heart raced with trepidation. He spoke first of a nation ambushed, its flag insulted, its laws scorned. He meticulously described the slow evaporation of neutrality, inexorably transforming into national peril. He spoke with compelling evidence, but also with profound humanity, evoking the anguish of the sailor's wife, the father waiting anxiously at home, the tradesman idling at the docks. He paused, measured each word carefully, then released the final, momentous lines, that if Great Britain continued its naval aggressions, then war would be the only viable way to secure a lasting peace upon honorable terms. The chambers fell into a profound hush, broken only by the rustling of papers. Madison's counsel was crystal clear, but the moment was heavy with destiny. Congress would decide. The nation would inevitably feel the immense consequences. Over the next few days, legislators introduced declarations of war. Votes were cast, passionate speeches made. Madison watched from the sidelines, desperately hoping that action would not undo his country, but fearing that inaction already had. On June 18th, the decision finally fell. Congress declared war. Madison's signature, applied deliberately, was both the culmination of months of agonizing deliberation and the very beginning of a profound national trial. In that singular act, Madison's dilemma found its resolution. Not because he desired war, but because he recognized a duty that transcended mere caution. He had witnessed diplomacy fail the nation's very heart, and concluded that when a country's children were seized, its laws mocked, and its dignity questioned, unwavering resolution became paramount responsibility. As he meticulously sealed the papers, the candle flickered. He contemplated the battles to come, on the sea, in the dense forests, on the vast lakes. He thought of the immense costs that would be paid in human flesh and hard coin. Yet, beneath those doubts, he also felt a deep anchor of conviction that a republic must sometimes risk itself entirely to remain truly free. The die was cast, the nation stood ready, and Madison, in that new dawn of war, profoundly understood that the line between fragile hope and grim necessity had been irrevocably crossed, and that history would judge both his monumental choice and its agonizing cost. The war would be hard, the battles unexpectedly brutal, the outcomes agonizingly uncertain. But on that morning, as the letter bearing news of war reached towns across the land, America stepped forward with its president's unwavering resolve, even as he carried the immense burden of war in his heart. Chapter 7, Declaration of War. America crosses the line, June 18th, 1812. The lamps in the Senate chamber cast a soft, yet tense, glow against a night steeped in anticipation. Across the nation, whispers had finally coalesced into an unshakable certainty. America would no longer quietly endure. That evening, ink met parchment under the solemn, weighty signature of President Madison. Congress had formally declared war on Great Britain. And with that simple, yet profound phrase, "War is hereby declared," the fragile, hopeful peace that had settled over generations was irrevocably shattered. The months leading to this momentous decision had been a brutal crucible of mounting anger. It had simmered in every sea-tossed fishing village, in every bustling riverfront mill town, and behind every closed door where a mother agonizingly counted the days without her son. The suffocating embargoes, the brazen seizures, the countless stolen sailors, they had been unforgivable affronts to national dignity. Now, a people who had once trembled under distant, imperial rule were vehemently refusing to tremble again. They had collectively resolved to stand firm, to defend their rights, and to fight with unyielding determination. Inside the ornate chamber, senators and representatives rose and sat, their voices rising and falling like the relentless tides. Some spoke of solemn duty and sober sacrifice, their tones grave and measured. Others thundered with unbridled pride, urgent conviction, and righteous indignation. They invoked vivid images of burned ship decks, torn sails, and the bloodied fathers whose harrowing stories filled taverns and print shops back home. They spoke as though each nugget of profound grief, each twisted plank of wooden wreckage, unequivocally demanded retribution. When the final vote was meticulously tallied, a nation held its collective breath. It was not unanimous, far from it, but it passed. War was declared. The Union, still fragile, had taken a monumental step into profound uncertainty. It had bravely chosen risk over cautious restraint, and it was not merely a legal act. It was a collective heartbeat, pulsing with an unyielding resolve. Outside the Capitol, torches were lit along Pennsylvania Avenue. Crowds gathered beneath a canvas sky, cheering for a cause that felt both terrifyingly risky and profoundly right. Drums began to roll. Bells rang out in nearby districts. The war began not merely on the deck of a ship lost at sea, but with the impassioned voices of 87 senators and 141 representatives who declared, "Enough." And yet, so many questions lingered unanswered. What could a nation of humble farms and fledgling factories truly accomplish against the mighty British Empire, the preeminent global power? Could America's tiny, nascent navy genuinely challenge the greatest naval force that had ever ruled the waves? Could its militia, comprised mostly of citizens armed with muskets and plows, possibly stand against disciplined British soldiers and their formidable indigenous allies? In homes across the land, families prayed beneath the soft glow of candlelight. Farmers paused mid-harvest. Merchants watched their ships idling uselessly at harbor. Sailors docked in Baltimore and Charleston prepared to set sail with profoundly uncertain fates. Even the year's oppressive summer heat felt charged with an almost palpable expectation, as though July itself waited to inhale the acrid smoke of battle. Beyond the borders, diplomats in London glanced dismissively at headlines, then quickly turned back to their complex Napoleonic maneuvering. They viewed America as a mere nuisance, yet also as a symbolic test. If America stood, could other empires follow suit? To the British, this was a test not just of foreign policy, but of unwavering imperial resolve. And so, the declaration of war resonated far beyond mere legalities. It was the rhythmic beating of drums, the proud raising of flags, the palpable tremor in the water as ships prepared to weigh anchor. It was the trembling of a nation that had once trembled before foreign powers, and now vehemently refused to tremble again. That night, across frontiers and farmlands, and in smoky ports, Americans paused. They reflected on the independence won 3 decades earlier. They thought of the soldiers who had endured the frozen ground of Valley Forge. They contemplated the immense sacrifices still to come. And in that moment, uncertain yet charged with destiny, they stepped irrevocably over the line. America had declared war. The die was cast. The fight would manifest in thunderous cannon fire and gleaming bayonets, in icy northern forests and sun-baked southern fields, on lakes and rivers and across the vast sea. The war would stretch minds, hearts, and souls to their very limits. But on June 18, 1812, it began with law, with unyielding resolve, and with immense emotional force. A nation had said enough. A nation had resolved to defend itself. A nation had crossed the line. And what followed would shape its future in ways that not even its fiercest advocates could fully foresee. Chapter 8. Invasion gone wrong. Detroit and Canada campaign failures. The winter sky over Detroit in 1812 was low and ashen, a stark mirror reflecting the creeping desperation that permeated the ranks of the U.S. Army. This was supposed to be America's shining moment, a swift, decisive blow that would carry the young republic confidently and unconquered into Canada. Instead, cold winds whispered mournfully through empty camps, and hope itself seemed to freeze in the hearts of thousands who had marched north with such fervent optimism in their eyes. From Washington to Boston, America's leaders had envisioned a glorious victory across the northern border. Conquering Canada, they firmly believed, would be decisively transformative. It would neutralize lingering British influence on the frontier, protect American settlers, and unequivocally demonstrate to the world that this nascent nation possessed formidable teeth. Yet, dreams rarely withstand the harsh realities of war, and by early July, those grand dreams would unravel in ways far more tragic than anyone could have anticipated. The ill-fated campaign began with General William Hull, a veteran of the Revolution, appointed to lead the American forces from Michigan Territory. He was a man of measured spirit, cautious by nature, and that very caution would tragically become his undoing. Hull arrived in Detroit, proudly raising the American flag on the shores of the Detroit River. Convinced that the mere presence of U.S. troops would intimidate the British and sway nearby native allies to remain neutral. But hubris met brutal truth. The British in Canada had meticulously forged strong relationships, armed and organized native bands, and planned their defense with meticulous precision. Hull reluctantly crossed into Canadian territory at Sandwich, present-day Windsor, but his forces faltered almost immediately. Supply lines were perilously thin. Centuries-old fortifications were under strength, and morale was brittle. News filtered in of fierce native warriors allied with the British, warriors loyal to Tecumseh's Confederacy, ready to resist any American advance. Hull hesitated, paralyzed by fear. He dreaded a massacre in the dense woods, an ambush that he believed he could not repel. His trusted officers desperately pleaded for immediate action. Civilian settlers, drawn into the occupation, waited anxiously for a decisive move. Yet Hull's gaze remained fixed solely on defense. On July 12, 1812, Major Edmund P. Gaines led a small detachment across the river to Fort Amherstburg. They found it lightly held and briefly raised the stars and stripes before retreating. It was a fleeting, symbolic moment, a glimmer of hope before harsh practical realities mercilessly stamped it out. The Americans were woefully ill-equipped for the unforgiving Canadian wilds. Supplies dwindled rapidly, and discipline frayed among the troops, many of whom were untrained and poorly clothed. Restlessness grew as British warships appeared upriver, menacingly threatening American naval gunboats. Misinformation proved even more dangerous than any bullet. Hull received wildly exaggerated reports. Hundreds of British regulars were massing, backed by thousands of native allies. Some claimed they were being relentlessly pursued through the forest at every turn. Whether intentional or accidental, the effect was precisely the same: utter immobilization. On July 16, as the formidable British General Isaac Brock approached Detroit, Hull convened a council of war. The sense of impending defeat was palpable. Seasoned officers, glancing at uniform cuffs, saw soldiers with hollow eyes. Volunteers, once fiery with patriotism, were cowed by pervasive rumors. Civilians sheltered in their homes, anxiously asking what had gone so terribly wrong. Gritty determination replaced optimism. Dread replaced firm resolve. That night, Hull made his fateful, disastrous choice. He drafted orders to surrender. His words were formal, yet his hand trembled as he wrote, "As Commander-in-Chief of the forces under my command." It was one of the most astonishing surrenders in American history. A fortified city, well armed, offering no resistance, simply turned over to the British without a single fight. On July 17, 1812, 2,500 American troops marched out of Fort Detroit, unshackled, unblooded, yet undeniably defeated. Back in Washington, shock quickly followed disbelief. Newspapers brazenly accused Hull of cowardice. The war hawks vehemently denounced it as treason. The administration scrambled desperately to regroup. But the physical and psychological damage was profound and deep. The northern frontier trembled. Canadian morale soared. Native bands renewed their resistance with invigorated fervor. Hull would face a court-martial. The army would struggle mightily to recover, and for the soldiers who surrendered, returning home was a bitter journey, indelibly marked by humiliation. But Detroit was only the beginning of a series of failures. Emboldened by their success, British forces pressed deeper into Michigan. Meanwhile, American plans to invade Upper Canada via the Niagara frontier faltered disastrously. Brigadier General Stephen Van Rensselaer, leading New York militia across the river at Lewiston and Queenston, found himself up against heavily fortified positions and swift British counterattacks. On October 13, in the Battle of Queenston Heights, militia panic forced American troops to retreat. General Isaac Brock, bravely leading the defense, was killed, but British forces tenaciously held the field. American lives were lost in scattered skirmishes along the frontier. Resource mismanagement severely compounded the failure of Detroit, starkly revealing a military machine utterly unprepared for offensive war. The failures of these early campaigns unveiled a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. The Republic's exalted dreams were built on fragile foundations. Supply chains were stretched thin across vast lakes and dense forests. Troops lacked essential battle-tested basics like proper uniforms, adequately trained officers, and seamless coordination with naval forces. Worse, America's leaders fundamentally underestimated the unwavering resolve of their opponents and the inherent complexity of frontier campaigns. Red-coated regulars would bugle at dawn. Native warriors would vanish and reappear like spectral ghosts. The land itself would test every single inch of progress. As winter approached, the American forces retreated, licking their wounds and nursing a profound shame. Detroit remained firmly under British control. The Niagara frontier would witness repeated battles and devastating burnings over the coming year. The hope of swift conquest lay utterly shattered. America was learning, through bitter experience, that to effectively fight Britain required far more than mere passion. It demanded meticulous planning, rigorous discipline, and unyielding political will. Behind the military failures lay poignant human stories. Soldiers, barely trained, awoke at midnight to learn they were prisoners of war. Families at home heard chilling rumors of cowardice. Letters spoke of hunger, of tears, of crushing defeat. Officers resigned in shame. Communities that had cheered the enthusiastic departure of troops now received back their sons in unmarked coffins. Canada, in stark contrast, found in these victories a burgeoning sense of nationhood, irrefutable proof that resolute resistance and unwavering loyalty could indeed repel conquest. But the war would continue. American leaders would regroup, militia would train, naval officers would sharpen their tactics. Detroit would forever remain the crucible of early defeat, a stark lesson in hubris, profound humility, and the exorbitant cost of naive assumption. That winter, Americans huddled around hearths and parlor fires, speaking in hushed tones of disgrace, but also of the unwavering resolve needed to right the ship. If the first invasion had failed, it had also, crucially, awakened the Republic to the harsh realities of war and the imperative need to master them. In the darkness, a simmering resolve smoldered. The subsequent campaigns would demand more, far more. But America had felt the searing sting of failure, and few would ever forget it. For every man who surrendered a fort, there would be another to fight and die. For every village lost on the Niagara frontier, another town would rise to send fresh troops. Detroit's fall would shape the war for years, relentlessly reminding a nation that crossing the line was easy, but staying true to the fight would require far more than mere courage. It would demand unwavering character, meticulous preparation, and profound unity. And so, Detroit's story is not solely one of failure, it is a mirror. It starkly showed America what war truly meant. It revealed that spotty uniforms, meager rations, and naive expectations were utterly insufficient. It demonstrated the critical need for meticulous preparation before pride. But beyond the failure lay an indomitable determination. The Republic would rebuild, and when winter thawed the frost of defeat, a nation would journey again northward, with clearer eyes, a firmer purpose, and lessons dearly, painfully learned. Chapter 9. The Battle of Queenston Heights. Late October dawned over the Niagara River, a biting chill in the autumn air and a tension that hung heavy on every brow. On October 13, 1812, American forces launched their first major, audacious attempt to invade Upper Canada across the narrow stream that separated two nations. In that fragile morning light, they fervently believed that bloodshed and battle might definitively redefine their hopes. This was to be their moment, to seize Canada, to avenge the recent disaster at Detroit, and to strike a powerful blow at British pride. But war has an unforgiving way of delivering truth harshly, and at Queenston Heights, that truth would be swift, cold, and relentlessly brutal. Across the river, on the Canadian shore, redcoats stood at the ready, disciplined regulars, determined militia, and formidable indigenous allies arrayed behind their proud red banners and the promise of impending victory. They were commanded by the astute Major General Sir Isaac Brock and his trusted Shawnee ally, Tecumseh. Here, strength was meticulously organized, purpose was unequivocally shared, and the very land itself, rocky ridges and scattered trees, carved out a natural stage where destiny would be irrevocably decided. The American force, under the command of the cautious Brigadier General Stephen Van Rensselaer, crossed in boats before dawn, burdened with both unbridled ambition and profound uncertainty. Between 30 and 40 men launched each craft in whispered silence. Their officers, men of privilege more accustomed to debating than battling, urged them forward with words of promise that they would secure a crucial foothold and significantly broaden the invasion by day's end. But the water, cold and unassuming, carried no assurances. As the boats rode under the fading moonlight, soldiers pondered whether this desperate fight would redeem Detroit or doom them once again. At dawn, the first wave struck the Canadian height. Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer, brother-in-law to the general, valiantly climbed with 40 men, planting the American flag atop rock and timber. It was a symbolic moment, marked with cheers and the acrid smoke of cannon fire, yet profoundly fragile. The ground beneath them was steep, their lines perilously thin, and reinforcements lagged far behind. From their vantage point, they could see their comrades building makeshift absences on the far bank, boats half-filled, troops hesitating, the very water dividing patriotism from panic. The British responded with immediate, ruthless precision. A detachment under Lieutenant Colonel John MacDonald rushed uphill, muskets cracking, only to stagger under a devastating American volley that felled their leader within moments. MacDonald lay dying beneath the flag he sought to defend. Worse yet, leadership crumbled under the intense firefight. The Height exchanged hands multiple times in hours that were more confusing than cruel. The wind carried desperate cries of, "Push on! Hold fast! Retreat!" Redcoats fell among the rocks. American militia hesitated below on the riverbank. General Brock arrived, his presence immediately galvanizing the defenders. Seeing the flag still defiantly flying despite threats and bloodshed, he led his men upward, pistol in hand, his voice throaty with unyielding resolve. "Take that hill!" he cried, firing a steady, single shot. It was a golden, tragic moment as Brock died instantly from a musket wound, falling on the ridge. The battle was irrevocably tipped. His death transformed from a profound loss into symbolic fuel for his men. Brock became a martyr. For the Americans, his death stoked fear, a wordless panic that rippled through the militia. Some terrified contingents drifted back across to American soil. Shots still cracked, but coordination collapsed. Order devolved into primal instinct, fight or flight. For every man who pressed on, another wavered. Atop the ridge, tension strained. American troops held the flag but were completely surrounded. Communication faltered, supplies ran perilously low. British regulars dug in, and native allies positioned along the flanks added immense pressure. No American line could repel them now. Surrender, once scarcely permissible, began to look utterly inevitable. When the British and Allied troops finally surrounded the hill, General Van Rensselaer, unwilling to risk total annihilation, approached Tecumseh's line. With dignity he surrendered. The words echoed across rock and valley, "I yield." It was a surrender not merely of soldiers, but of a promise that America might march north and change the course of the war. That promise died atop Queenston Heights. In Lower Canada, cheers rang out. The border towns breathed a unified sigh of relief. Bishops' churches rang with bells of thanksgiving. Soldiers laid wreaths for Brock. In Upper Canada, loyalty was renewed. volunteers flocked to regiments, determined never to yield again. In America, the reaction was sharp. Newspapers headline: "Defeat at Queenston, Hope Betrayed." Communities that had sent sons north mourned those lost and captured. Towns demanded accountability. The warhawks, who'd optimistically hoped Canada would fall swiftly, found only sterile silence. Congress met. General Van Rensselaer's resignation was tendered. His promise of conquest had turned to rubble. But among Americans, especially those who had crossed into Canada, the ideals that had carried them remained. Their march east had been bold. They had learned the harsh shape of war, where flags, even bright ones, offer no guarantee. Where valor alone cannot carry a nation, and where battlefields are shaped as much by terrain and timing as by raw courage. Queenston Heights starkly confirmed that war is not merely a test of spirit. It tests organization, training, supply chains, and leadership. It tests the will of a nation to invest, like interlocking compacts, requiring both profound sacrifice and sustained sustenance. Canada was not a prize for the taking. It was a shield held firm by people who fiercely believed in its defense. For the Americans taken prisoner, the return journey was long, on foot or aboard grim prison ships, through Canada's unforgiving wilds, through winters arriving, through a painful reconciliation with failure. Some were paroled into rotisseries and taverns, others were exchanged. Yet each carried home stories of blurred faces and burning heights, of plunging defeat and unflagging hope that something greater would eventually rise. By the war's end, Queenston Heights would be taught in schools, America's first major defeat on land. But overshadowed by later victories at Lake Erie, Baltimore, and New Orleans, it would become a chapter, not a conclusive ending. The Republic might walk humbly, but it had not fallen. But the ridge remained, an unmoving testament, and on it died visions of conquest and illusions of easy war. Canada required its defenders. America required its challenges. Their conflict would span lakes and forests, cities and farms. The war's currents would flow into diplomacy, commerce, independence, and fervent nationalism. Queenston Heights was the crucible, reminding both nations that war is never swift, war is never simple, and war demands more than flags, more than mere faith. It demands unity, readiness, sheer muscle, and the grit to rebuild after each crushing failure. And so, the ridge stands unchanging, a silent witness to smoke, to blood, to heroism, to failure. In the battle's silence, there is memory. It is quiet, but it speaks, and we listen, because the promise of war is never sweet. It is a promise paid in blood and lumps, and those who cross its line, whether on heights or waves, will come to know that truth sooner or later. Chapter 10: Naval Sparks. The USS Constitution vs. HMS Guerriere. The thunderous roar of cannons, the sharp crack of musket fire, the stinging salt spray on eyes, and the agonizing creak of timber under relentless assault. On a late summer day in August 1812, far from the bitter shores where armies faltered, a battle at sea would ignite a new, defining chapter in the young United States struggle for respect. The USS Constitution, a majestic frigate meticulously crafted from resilient American oak and boundless ambition, squared off against the formidable British HMS Guerriere. It was a duel that would reverberate through history as irrefutable proof that America, though nascent and still untested, could indeed challenge the greatest naval power on the planet. The seas had long been an undisputed domain where Britain reigned supreme. Its Royal Navy was the largest, the most experienced, and arguably the most feared maritime force the world had ever witnessed. For decades, British ships had relentlessly patrolled the vast oceans, asserting absolute control over vital trade routes, blockading enemies, and projecting the immense power of an empire that spanned continents. The United States, by stark contrast, was a fledgling nation with a modest navy and ambitions that far outstripped its meager resources. Its ships were fewer, smaller, and often outgunned. And yet, by 1812, the very idea of American naval prowess began to stir. fueled by the simmering anger at relentless British interference, the abhorrent practice of impressment, and the growing, impassioned call to defend national honor. The USS Constitution, affectionately nicknamed Old Ironsides by her adoring crew, was a powerful symbol of American resilience and ingenuity. Built with thick, incredibly resilient live oak timbers, she seemed almost impervious to enemy fire. Her decks were manned by a crew hardened by experience, and an unshakable belief that they could hold their own against any foe. Captain Isaac Hull commanded her with steady, unwavering resolve, a man who keenly understood the stakes were immensely high, but who deeply trusted in the unparalleled skill and indomitable spirit of his men. On August 19, 1812, off the coast of Nova Scotia, near Boston, the USS Constitution spotted the HMS Guerriere. The British frigate, once a proud ship but now worn and weathered by years of relentless service, was on patrol. Captain James Deckers was in command, an officer seasoned by years of naval warfare, supremely confident that his ship could swiftly deal with the American vessel. The two ships meticulously maneuvered, the wind and waves their silent partners and formidable enemies both. Both captains knew that victory hinged not only on sheer firepower but on cunning strategy, precise timing, and masterful seamanship. The sea was a vast, unforgiving battlefield, unpredictable and merciless. The guns roared just after noon. 18-pounder cannonballs tore into rigging and splintered wood as schooners and brigs closed the distance. American sailors returned fire, cannon smoke curled skyward, momentarily obscuring the horizon. Each volley carried immense risk. British fire cut deep into the Lawrence's deck. Men fell, blood pooling on the planks. Perry himself was wounded, shrapnel tearing through his shoulder. Yet amid the smoke and chaos, his voice rang out, "Don't give up the ship!" When the Lawrence was too damaged to continue the fight, Perry, displaying incredible courage, transferred to his relief ship, the Niagara. Rowing through choppy waters under enemy fire, a feat of seamanship and sheer bravery rare in combat, his youth seemed to transform into unwavering resolve on the Niagara's deck. He signaled his fleet, expertly turned his ship, and decisively re-engaged the enemy. The pivot was swift, and with renewed vigor, American guns roared again, focusing their devastating fire on the British flagship, the Detroit. Rudder shot away, hull ablaze, the Detroit lay dead in the water. Another British vessel faltered. Slowly, unmistakably, the tide of battle turned. Minutes later, the British struck their colors, a salvo of cheers erupting from American decks. The lake unequivocally belonged to the United States. Perry, though wounded, rowed back to the Lawrence's deck to send his famous dispatch. "We have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner and 1 sloop." It was not only a message of victory. It was a powerful declaration that the strategic course of North America had irrevocably shifted. The consequences were immediate, with control of Lake Erie secured. American forces were liberated to move vital supplies and troops across the water, effectively cutting off British support to native allies and stranding General Proctor's forces in Canada. The Americans then advanced deeper into Upper Canada, leading to the pivotal Battle of the Thames and the tragic loss of Tecumseh, further fracturing native resistance. But beyond the battlefields, the victory won hearts across the nation. Americans rallied, their belief renewed. Newspapers proclaimed Perry a national hero. Shipyards shone with new building efforts across the frontier. Settlers felt a renewed sense of safety. Soldiers renewed their grim resolve. Confidence radiated from the lake shore to the Mississippi. Yet victory at Erie came at a price. Nearly 80 American lives were lost, many more wounded. Families received letters littered with both profound loss and fervent pride. Perry's wounded arm told a silent story of sacrifice, a necessary cost of commanding a nation's destiny. Historically, the Battle of Lake Erie stands as a true turning point. It secured American control of the Northwest, shattered British naval dominance on inland waters, and proved that the United States, though young, could indeed field effective naval power. More than a mere military fact, it was a national affirmation, a testament to unwavering resolve, meticulous craftsmanship, and inspired leadership. The waters of Erie, often calm now, hold beneath their waves the enduring memory of that day's smoke, thunder, courage, and command. They remind us that history can profoundly shift upon small vessels in open water, where hearts decide more than empires. Perry's victory was not just for him or his fleet. It was for a nation learning to defend itself, to frame its identity, and to believe in its own burgeoning promise. So, the lake that September day became ground sacred to American memory, a turning tide, sealing a moment when a fledgling republic faced its greatest seaborne challenge and answered it with unyielding determination, unwavering resilience, and profound unity. Lake Erie was won. The frontier was safe. The path forward had been carved on water, on land, and in the hearts of a rising nation. Chapter 13. Tecumseh's death and the Battle of the Thames. The morning mist swirled over the Thames River in October 1813, softening the horizon like a painting about to be revealed. But beneath that fragile veil lay a storm of unimaginable violence and inexorable destiny. This day would not be merely another clash of arms, it would be a culmination, a profound reckoning that would reverberate across the ancient forests of native resistance. It was here, amid timber and deep-rooted tradition, that Tecumseh, the visionary Shawnee leader who had bound disparate tribes into a formidable confederacy, and stood as a towering bulwark against relentless American expansion, would tragically fall. His death would irrevocably shatter the hope of united indigenous resistance, and dramatically shift the momentum of the War of 1812. In the days leading up to the battle, Major General William Henry Harrison meticulously assembled his forces at the banks of the Thames, brimming with the hope that with control of Lake Erie now secured, British and native forces in Upper Canada could be strategically cornered. Around that same time, Tecumseh rallied what remained of his confederation: Shawnee, Potawatomi, Odawa, Chippewa, Wyandot, calling them to stand firm against the encroaching tide. He spoke with urgent intensity. Settlers would be uprooted, the forests would remember injustice. This was their homeland. With his brother Tenskwatawa, spiritual fire ignited belief across the frost-strewn fields. Tecumseh's voice carried like thunder, unity, dignity, destiny. British Major General Henry Proctor, with a mix of regular troops and militia, prepared to meet Harrison, but his British officers were fewer than promised. Some had deserted, reluctant to engage. His native allies looked to Tecumseh for guidance, trusting his profound vision over British caution. In those uneasy days, only one grim certainty remained: when the bullets flew, the world would keenly feel what was truly at stake. On October 5th, Harrison crossed the Thames with 2,000 men. As they hurried through villages and woodlands, local inhabitants fled or hid, bracing against the profound displacement that always accompanied war. Tecumseh and his warriors meticulously prepared their defenses. Their lines, less formal than European formations, were deeply rooted in the strength of the forest. Ambush points, concealed positions, fallen logs, patience, and nature itself were their powerful allies. At dawn on October 5th, the battle began. Musket fire sliced through the crisp air, echoing through the trees. British and native artillery pounded the American lines. Warriors fought with a ferocity born of raw survival. Tecumseh moved among them, arrows etched with promise ready to be loosed, even as he wielded a musket himself. His very presence inspired ferocity. Men breathed deeper, paused in prayer, and brushed aside fear. But Harrison's men advanced relentlessly. They formed ranks, pushing forward, their bullets tearing through native cover. British regulars fell in missteps of coordination. With each volley, momentum shifted. Willow and oak shivered under the immense weight of battle. Yells of defiance were answered with cries of pain. Neither side yielded. Tecumseh fought on, flanking and countering, urging his warriors forward. A bullet struck the ground near him, sending debris into his face. He remained standing, shouting commands, his hands, once skilled in diplomacy, now gripping an American rifle with resolute purpose. He pushed forward through smoke and blood, determined to rally his followers. But fate intervened. An American rifleman, concealed behind a log, fired. The bullet struck Tecumseh in the chest. He staggered, then fell, his body resting against broken wood and fallen leaves. With one last breath, he uttered a prayer for his people. His death was swift, yet its profound shock reverberated across the entire battlefield. Many of his warriors paused, disbelief flickering across their faces. Some rallied in unbridled anger. Others fled. The currents of unity irrevocably broke. British troops, lacking support and demoralized by the retreat, melted away. When the shooting finally died down, Harrison's army advanced across silent ground. Graves marked those who had fallen, British, American, and native alike. The Thames, once serene, now carried echoes of profound loss. Villages burned. Families emerged to find their homes emptied, their culture battered. The environment, sacred to many, was irrevocably altered. New treaties would follow, promises broken and borders redrawn. For Harrison's men, it was a hard-won victory, pride tempered by respect for fallen foes. They had defeated a British force, but more importantly, they had ended Tecumseh's dream. To them, this meant strategic advantage. Control of the Northwest would shift definitively to America. To native survivors, it meant the agonizing collapse of a unified resistance. Without Tecumseh, their solidarity unraveled. British overtures faltered, now more distant, more detached. The frontier began a dangerous transformation from contested land to conquered expansion. News of the battle spread back to Baltimore, along Appalachian ridges, through emerging towns like Chicago. Americans cheered for Harrison, the Warhawks hailed the victory. Yet, there were quieter voices of grief, of doubt, of fear, voices that knew treaties would erode freedoms as surely as sacred trees. Native communities felt the rupture beneath their feet. Some retreated westward, others remained, desperately seeking new ways to survive. Families mourned a leader who had given them hope. For many, the die was cast, the future would require adaptation. Treaties, negotiations, or flight. In Canada, the echoes were different. They mourned their British dead, they hailed their native allies as defenders of their land. But they also sensed that the war was irrevocably tilting, and that victory over North America's confederated defense had altered their sense of neighborly cooperation. Tecumseh's death at the Thames marked a profound turning point, not merely in military terms, but in the moral bedrock of the nation. It signaled the devastating failure of an indigenous coalition that had dared to stand against America's relentless expansion. It also underscored the profound tragedy of war. A man of vision failed in his pursuit of land protection and identity, a focus not on lines drawn on maps, but on lives broken, voices silenced, people displaced. For Americans, the battle meant opportunity, safer frontiers, unchallenged settlements, new treaties. But it also meant lost voices, voices of negotiation, of prophecy, of unity that might have enriched the nation's character. In the coming years, as settlements climbed onto native lands and towns spread across forests, the spiritual and political space once held by those who followed Tecumseh would vanish. In the wider arc of the war, the Battle of the Thames loosened the grip of British influence in the Northwest. It secured American pathways to victory, but at a devastating cost, a cost of broken spirits, burned homes, and futures hollowed by grief, which would haunt the frontier for generations. Today, on the plains beside the Thames River, markers stand to commemorate the battle. But beyond stone and plaque, the story of Tecumseh's death is carried in oral tradition. In songs passed between generations, in quiet reflections of resilience and loss. The vision of unity, though fleeting, remains a testament to what might have been. Tecumseh fell that autumn day. A dream of united indigenous resistance died with him. But his spirit lives on in the courage of resistance, in calls for justice, in the profound thought that people, when united, can challenge even the mightiest nations. His fall reminds us that power may conquer land, but courage shapes history. At the Thames, the currents flow again, silently, but with memory. We listen. For in that silence is the wound of broken promises, of futures foreclosed, and of a world reconfigured forever. Chapter 14. Burning Along the Border. Niagara and York. The early spring sun of 1813 glimmered over the Niagara frontier as American troops advanced into Upper Canada with a palpable sense of purpose and expectation. They carried in their hearts the bitter taste of 1812's failures: Detroit lost, Queenston Heights unrealized, hope flagging. Their targets were clear: the forts and farms of Niagara and the capital of Upper Canada, York. What followed would be a campaign marred by fire and fury. Actions whose echoes would indelibly shape the war's course and forever alter neighborly bonds. By late April, American forces under General Henry Dearborn, supported by Commodore Isaac Chauncey's fleet, sailed from Sackett's Harbor toward York. They moved in the pre-dawn hush of April 27th. Initial resistance was minimal. British troops retreated under pressure. But their departure carried a devastating surprise. A massive explosion ripped through the fort's powder magazine. Debris rained down, taking more than 50 American lives, including Brigadier General Zebulon Pike, and leaving over 200 wounded. Amid the smoke and shock, American soldiers surged into York. What began as a military operation soon dissolved into chaos. Discipline broke down. Soldiers, embittered from prior losses, looted homes and businesses. Parliament buildings, Government House, and the town's printing press were torched, symbols of British authority reduced to ashes. American commanders framed the destruction as a strategic necessity, but to residents, it felt like a brutal home invasion, a dethronement of dignity. For 6 days, the Americans held York. They seized supplies, commandeered ships, and rifled through militia records. Yet when a gale stranded Chauncey's fleet at Sackett's Harbor, they were forced to withdraw on May 8th, leaving a devastated city behind. Across the Niagara River, a parallel operation had struck Niagara-on-the-Lake earlier in May. American forces captured Fort George on May 27th, routing the British and claiming the peninsula as a staging ground. But their victory lacked permanence. British troops and their native allies retreated to fortified positions, leaving Niagara under tenuous control. American commanders believed York's burning would cow Canadian spirit. Instead, it inflamed it. Villages once tranquil now brimmed with resentment. Loyalists and indigenous allies who had felt the weight of American brutality turned to fierce opposition. The frontier, they realized, was no longer merely a contested land. It was a battlefield of raw emotion and burning vengeance. Tensions reached their peak in December of that year at Newark, now Niagara-on-the-Lake. American forces, preparing to withdraw, chose wanton destruction over honorable surrender. More than 300 buildings, homes, barns, stores, were ordered burned in the bitter winter cold. Villagers fled into the snow and darkness. Some perished from exposure, others were left with nothing but haunting memories. The British retaliated quickly and with devastating destructiveness. Under Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond, they crossed into New York on December 18th. They captured Fort Niagara, massacred some prisoners, and burned Lewiston and Black Rock, reducing nearly every building to embers. Allied indigenous fighters, stung by their own suffering, joined the onslaught. Finally, on December 30th, Buffalo was torched. The village's homes, barns, and ships were set ablaze. Only resilient structures like the stone jail and a widow's quiet home stood firm amid the devastation. Civilians fled in terror, their hearts left in the lingering soot. This was not Cold War. It was a burning crescendo of civilian suffering and tit-for-tat destruction. Each blaze sparked another, each retaliation fed more raging vengeance. Niagara's frontier became a brutal crucible where neighbors turned on neighbors, and rules of war were broken in the name of raw revenge. In later years, Americans claimed that the British burned Washington in 1814 in retribution for York's burning, a grim, cyclical justice. Historians often recall Niagara as something darker, civil war by another name. One nation's frontiers turned inside out, lit by the terrifying torches of retribution. Chapter 14 is a haunting story of tinder and blaze, of soldiers acting out of bitterness, of civilians caught helplessly between borders, of war burning homes more than merely generals' names. York's burning tragically transformed conquest into cultural desecration. Newark's fate starkly showed how retaliation spirals into horror. Buffalo's ashes prove that devastation crosses all sides. By war's end, both nations found ruin at their feet. Peace eventually returned, but the scars remained indelible. Canadians remembered York and Newark, Americans remembered Niagara and Buffalo. The frontier held their memories. The war left behind ashes, but also hard-won lessons. It demonstrated how civilian lives, once thought separate from war, became its tragic center. It taught that retaliation is a wound that bleeds inward, and it displayed the indomitable resilience of people who rebuild amidst the ruins to create lives in the shadows of fire. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, Niagara would endure. Its regrowth would be shaped by trauma but also by enduring hope. From the ashes, peace eventually emerged. But never forgetting, that is the profound legacy of border burning, not just destruction, but the fragile rebirth that follows, and the cautionary vow that flame is not justice, and victory costs far too much. Chapter 15: Chesapeake Raids and Coastal Harassment. The Chesapeake Bay in 1813 was an open wound, a sprawling inlet of commerce and community, but also a vulnerable gateway for an enemy determined to strike America where it felt most exposed. The British arrived not with full armies but with swift ships and ruthless intent. Their mission was crystal clear: to strike along the eastern seaboard, to stamp the flag of the empire onto American soil, and to show a nation that had declared peace yet prepared for war just how fragile its security truly was. In early spring, the Royal Navy squadron slipped ominously into Hampton Roads. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, once content with merely blockading distant ports, now craved direct confrontation. He had grown emboldened by past ventures. The Chesapeake was now his stage, and he intended blunt, devastating disruption. Towns were no longer off-limits. They were explicit targets. He would burn, loot, and destroy if it brought America to its knees. Havre de Grace, on Maryland's northern edge, found itself in the crosshairs. On May 3rd, as mist lingered over the Susquehanna, Royal Marines and seamen swooped in by boat. Militia fires were returned, but only briefly. Buildings were looted, homes set ablaze, civilians fled in terror. Locals vividly recalled the sight of rockets streaking through the dawn skies, setting timber and terror aflame. In minutes, a quiet village was transformed into ash and haunting memory. By June, Cockburn had shifted south. He descended on Craney Island, Virginia, then on Hampton, which endured relentless naval bombardment and a brutal ground assault. Militia lines collapsed, houses, taverns, barns, all were torched. Reports spoke of widespread civilian suffering. Women assaulted, families tortured. The press vehemently condemned the acts. Wounds were raw, and the Chesapeake felt the searing echo. Americans responded with unbridled anger, profound confusion, and disbelief. How could a navy preoccupied with distant Europe now torment their own coasts so mercilessly? The navy and militia were ill-prepared, gunboats skirmished ineffectively. Commanders advised evacuation, pleas rose for reinforcements. The debates in Congress shifted. These were not distant frontier wars, they were direct attacks at home. Then came the summer of 1814. Britain, fresh from victory in Europe after Napoleon's abdication, committed more ships and soldiers to America. Coburn's squadron returned stronger, more aggressive. Their canvas flags unfurled deep into the bay and river. Proclamations invited enslaved people to freedom if they joined the British. Hundreds fled plantations seeking refuge aboard British ships. They became guides, intelligence sources, marines. The very nature of war was evolving, and the Chesapeake became the crucible of liberty, as well as utter destruction. In June, British forces launched assaults up the Rappahannock, the Patuxent, and small coastal creeks. Private homes, iron works, and shipyards were systematically razed. Fires spread along the riverside. Commerce was halted. Panic rippled inland. Then, on August 19th, the campaign turned calculated and strategic. British troops landed at Benedict, Maryland, and descended the Patuxent. They cornered and destroyed Commodore Barney's flotilla on the river. From there, they pressed north toward Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, lying vulnerably by the Potomac. The result was terrifying. At Bladensburg, American forces briefly stood and held, but were then utterly routed. The British marched unopposed into Washington. Government buildings were looted and torched, the Capitol, the Executive Mansion. Ambassadors and secretaries fled as flames consumed symbols of nationhood. The Chesapeake, its waters marred by shellfire, its coast lined with destruction, had provided the path to an unprecedented assault on the very seat of American government. It showed not only the immense reach of British naval power but also the profound vulnerability that came with rivers and bays tied to political heartbeats. Yet, as the smoke curled skyward from Washington, the Chesapeake proved once again to be a place of resilience. Baltimore fortified, militia waited. Baltimore's cannons threw bricks into the harbor rivers when British forces arrived in September. Their landing at North Point and bombardment of Fort McHenry met with fierce American resistance. Overnight, rifle fire and cannon light illuminated the harbor, and no one would again say the Chesapeake was undefended. In the aftermath, the Chesapeake raids revealed harsh truths and enduring tensions. They showed how naval power could reach deep into America's veins, how war could no longer obey geographical boundaries. They also ignited a fierce sense of unity and resistance. Privateers arose from Baltimore, militia drilled under familiar rounds of cannon. Dreams of secession fled under the unifying banner of national protection. An old harbor town like St. Michael's would later claim it fooled the British by hanging lanterns in marshes, drawing ships away from the town itself. Whether true or myth, the legend perfectly captured the atmosphere that the Chesapeake was both a desperate battleground and a resilient bastion. For hundreds of enslaved people, the raids revealed opportunity as well as horror. The promise of freedom, woven into Britain's proclamations, gave many the courage to escape an unknown future, preferring it over continued bondage. The war was swift, violent, and profoundly disruptive, but in that chaos, lives were claimed not only by bullets, but by newly found liberty. The Chesapeake Campaign, then, was neither a mere footnote nor a distraction. It was the relentless beating of a war machine against America's home front. It broke hearts and buildings. It shattered illusions. It opened both grievous wounds and vital ways forward. In the end, peace would return. Washington would be rebuilt. Baltimore would survive. Plantation families would regroup. Yet deep in the Chesapeake Marsh, new voices would carry tales of escape. In burned towns, stories of heroism and defiance would shape future generations' view of the nation's character. The Chesapeake raids remain a testament to war's far-reaching grasp, how it consumes not only soldiers but souls, and how a nation's heart is often measured by the fires it withstands and the unity it rebuilds. Chapter 16. Napoleon's fall frees British forces. The spring of 1814 brought an unexpected calm to Europe, a silence that spoke of empires exhausted and wars too long fought. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the tempestuous force of the continent, had finally fallen, exiled to Elba, his vast armies dispersed. And under that stillness lay a profound transformation in global power projections for Britain. Victory in Europe meant more than mere peace. It meant an unprecedented opportunity. The seasoned troops that had clashed with Napoleon would soon turn their formidable gaze across the Atlantic, to a war that had simmered in their absence. Since the dawn of the War of 1812, British forces in North America had been cautious, constrained by immense commitments in Europe. While the Royal Navy maintained a blockade along the Atlantic, seasoned infantry regiments remained tied to the Peninsula War, wary and distant. But with Napoleon finally subdued, Britain had no rival demand on its veteran forces. Thousands of soldiers, many hardened in the dust and blood of Spain, became available, ready to serve once more under the proud Union Jack. By June 1814, a fresh, overwhelming wave of British troops departed Europe. These were not raw recruits, but elite regiments, veterans of countless sieges and leapfrogging battles, rigorously disciplined in the tactics of Wellington's army. They sailed to Halifax and Bermuda before being deployed to Canada and dispatched along North America's coastlines. The goal was unmistakably clear: to shift from mere blockade to aggressive advance, from defense to decisive offensive, and to bring the full might of the empire to bear on a growing, defiant republic. Their arrival was profoundly decisive. On the strategic waterways of the Great Lakes, British-Indian alliance lines stiffened. On the frontier, militia held ground under renewed, immense pressure. On the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic coast, squadrons of redcoats and Marines disembarked near river mouths and towns. Even Newfoundland's cold docks brimmed with ships carrying reinforcements. Within months, the war pressed closer to America's major cities. By August, officers like Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross were moving on Washington. Their forces, expertly trained in European siegecraft, easily feinted through militia lines at Bladensburg with minimal resistance. They stormed into the nation's capital and set fire to the Capitol, White House, and other public buildings, all within 24 hours. Their blazing torches were met with thunder and rain, but the image endured. An empire's power laid bare against a fledgling democracy. It was a dramatic reversal, a foreign army burning the very halls of American government. It shattered the illusion of invulnerability. American pride, so hard won on battles like Lake Erie, now quivered under the acrid smoke of Washington's ruins. But it also had unintended, yet profound, consequences. American resolve became sharper. Baltimore fortified, militia trained, and a fervent longing for national unity grew stronger. Meanwhile, British veterans marched along other shores, Champlain, Maine, the Gulf Coast, each in their own right testing America's defenses. Their skill, discipline, and confidence gave them early victories, but they were facing a different America now, one increasingly ready to mobilize, to adapt, and to fight back harder. The redeployment of British forces underscored the war's deeper arc. Once a secondary front to Europe's fires, the War of 1812 had transformed into a primary theater, inviting veteran soldiers. Napoleon's fall had changed everything. It shifted the balance, extended battle lines, and brought battle-hardened troops to test American survival. By fall, with treaties being drafted in Ghent, the war seemed poised for its final act. Britain had brought its best, yet America had discovered its true potential. In the years ahead, historians would judge not only battles but the profound resilience that emerged from a nation forced to stand on its own feet. Napoleon may have fallen, but his shadow had already cast a long war onto the United States. In the silence that followed his defeat, a new intensity rose, one that would decide whether a republic could withstand the full force of empire. Chapter 17: The Burning of Washington, D.C. In the late summer of 1814, the very heart of the United States, the nation's capital, stood on the precipice of utter destruction. Washington, D.C., a nascent symbol of a young republic's hopes and ambitions, was about to face an assault that would forever indelibly mark the War of 1812 in American memory. The burning of Washington was not merely a military event, it was a profound psychological blow. A moment that laid bare the agonizing vulnerability of a fledgling nation under siege. The British, freshly reinforced after Napoleon's abdication, had seized the opportune moment to strike a powerful, symbolic blow. Under the formidable command of Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn, a well-trained, battle-hardened force advanced swiftly through Maryland, their aim undeniably clear: to punish the Americans and fundamentally shake their resolve. The defense of Washington was tragically left to a motley assembly of hastily gathered militia, ill-equipped regulars, and exhausted troops, many utterly unprepared for the ferocious intensity of the oncoming storm. On August 24, 1814, the Battle of Bladensburg unfolded. It was a brief, brutal encounter. American forces, disorganized and woefully under-equipped, were overwhelmingly defeated. Their lines broke quickly, allowing British troops to march unopposed toward the capital. The swift retreat of American defenders sent shock waves through the city. Residents fled in panic, government officials scrambled to protect vital documents, and a pervasive fear gripped the streets. As British soldiers entered Washington, they moved with a grim, unwavering determination. Their orders were explicit: to destroy the very symbols of American governance. First came the Capitol building, a grand structure still under construction, representing the legislative heart of the Republic. The British set fires that rapidly consumed its wooden interiors. Flames licked at the sky, smoke billowed, and the dome's incomplete skeleton was starkly silhouetted against the burning horizon. Next, the White House, the executive mansion and residence of President James Madison, fell victim to the invaders. Once a proud symbol of American leadership, it was soon engulfed in flames. Windows shattered, walls blackened by smoke, furniture, artwork, and personal belongings were destroyed or looted. The sight of the president's home in ruins sent a jarring message: no place was safe, no symbol sacred. Throughout the city, other public buildings, the Treasury, War Department, Navy Yard, were also targeted. British troops conducted systematic destruction, their torches and powder igniting a wave of devastation that reshaped the physical and emotional landscape of the capital. Yet amid the destruction, some buildings, such as the Patent Office and certain churches, were spared, whether by design or circumstance. The burning of Washington was not merely tactical, it was strategic theater. The British aimed to demoralize, to expose American weakness to both domestic and foreign eyes. In the grand tradition of warfare, they sought to show that the Republic, despite its ideals and declarations, could be humbled. But the American response, both immediate and lasting, was far from defeat. News of the burning galvanized citizens, igniting a surge of patriotism and fierce resilience. The haunting memory of Washington's fiery night became a rallying point, a vivid reminder of what was truly at stake. Efforts to rebuild began almost immediately, the charred ruins a testament to both vulnerability and unwavering determination. In the aftermath, the British forces withdrew, their mission seemingly accomplished. But the scars they left ran deep. Washington's destruction reshaped American perceptions of security and identity. It underscored the profound fragility of the Republic and the fierce, unyielding need to defend its vital institutions. This dark night in August became etched in the collective consciousness, a somber chapter in the story of a nation rigorously tested by fire. Yet from those ashes, a renewed spirit emerged. The War of 1812 would continue, but the burning of Washington, D.C. remained a stark reminder that freedom required constant vigilance, immense sacrifice, and unwavering resolve. Chapter 18. The Defense of Baltimore and the Star-Spangled Banner. As the acrid smoke from the burning of Washington, D.C. still hung heavy in the air, the British forces turned their formidable sights toward Baltimore, Maryland, an important port city and a powerful symbol of American resilience. The ensuing attack on Baltimore in September 1814 would become one of the defining moments of the War of 1812, a profound testament to the indomitable spirit of the American people, and a night that would inspire the creation of the nation's anthem. Baltimore was a city on edge. The recent devastation of the capital had severely rattled the nation's confidence. Yet Baltimore's citizens and defenders steeled themselves with unyielding determination. The city was guarded by an intricate network of forts and batteries, the most critical of which was Fort McHenry, standing sentinel at the very entrance to Baltimore Harbor. Its strategic position unequivocally controlled access to the city by sea, making it the gateway that the British absolutely had to breach to strike Baltimore itself. The British naval fleet, led by Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, prepared to unleash a relentless bombardment designed to break the fort's defenses and pave the way for a ground assault. Their fleet was formidable, boasting some of the finest ships of the era, including the powerful HMS Euryalus and HMS Meteor. Across the harbor, American forces under the command of Major George Armistead readied themselves for what would become a fierce and sustained battle. On the night of September 13, 1814, the British fleet opened fire. The sky above Baltimore was pierced by a storm of mortar shells and rockets, each explosion casting eerie glows and shifting shadows across the waters and the fort's sturdy walls. For 25 grueling hours, the relentless bombardment raged. The air was thick with acrid smoke. The ground shook with each thunderous blast, and the defenders faced a ceaseless onslaught that rigorously tested their courage and unyielding resolve. Inside Fort McHenry, the defenders valiantly endured, their spirits unbroken despite the deafening thunder of artillery. Cannons roared back, returning fire with precision and fierce determination. The fort's walls, battered but unyielding, absorbed the British assault. Soldiers and sailors worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded, reloading guns, and resolutely holding their positions through the long, harrowing night. Amid this chaos stood Francis Scott Key, a young lawyer and amateur poet who had been detained aboard a British ship. Key had gone to negotiate the release of a prisoner, but found himself unable to leave, trapped on the water with a front-row view of the entire bombardment. Through the smoke and blinding flashes of light, he watched anxiously, desperately hoping to see the American flag still flying majestically over Fort McHenry at dawn. As dawn broke on September 14th, Key's eyes were drawn to the fort. There, high above the battered walls, the huge American flag, its stripes and stars vividly illuminated by the morning sun, still waved proudly in the breeze. The sight filled Key with a surging sense of relief and profound patriotism. Inspired by the moment, he began to write a poem that would capture the resilience, hope, and defiance of a nation under siege. Key's verses, originally titled Defense of Fort McHenry, soon became famously known as The Star-Spangled Banner. The poem vividly described the flag's survival against overwhelming odds, a powerful symbol of American endurance. Lines like, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light," echoed the triumph of those who stood firm against overwhelming force. The defense of Baltimore was not only a significant military victory but a profound moral boost for the United States. The British fleet, unable to breach Fort McHenry's defenses, eventually withdrew, marking a pivotal turning point in the war. The city itself was saved from destruction, and the American forces went on the offensive in other theaters, buoyed by the courage displayed at Baltimore. This episode perfectly captured the essence of the War of 1812, struggles of survival, fierce determination, and moments of unexpected heroism. The resilience of Fort McHenry and the birth of the Star-Spangled Banner became enduring symbols, echoing through American history as powerful reminders of sacrifice and unity. The war would continue, but on that morning, beneath the rising sun and the proudly waving flag, America found a powerful emblem of identity, one that would inspire generations to come. Chapter 19. Northern Theater, Battle of Plattsburgh. As the War of 1812 relentlessly dragged on into its third brutal year, the northern frontier between the United States and British Canada transformed into a pivotal, fiercely contested battleground. The vast wilderness of upstate New York, dotted with serene lakes, winding rivers, and dense, ancient forests, meticulously set the stage for a confrontation that would prove decisive not only for the immediate region but for the war itself. This was the Battle of Plattsburgh, fought in September 1814, a fierce, climactic clash of naval might and land forces that would irrevocably shape the fate of the Northern Theater and, ultimately, the entire course of the conflict. Plattsburgh, a small, unassuming town nestled along the western shore of Lake Champlain, strategically sat at the crossroads of vital invasion routes between Canada and the United States. Controlling this crucial gateway was absolutely essential for the British. Victory here promised to open a direct corridor deep into the American heartland, menacing New York and New England. For the Americans, holding Plattsburgh was a matter of sheer survival, a bulwark against relentless British incursions that possessed the potential to devastate the fledgling nation. The British plan was bold and meticulously methodical. Commanded by Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost, the British aimed to launch a two-pronged assault. A naval attack on Lake Champlain to secure absolute dominance over the waters, coupled with a coordinated land invasion to seize the town itself. Their objective was crystal clear: crush American resistance, shatter the frontier defenses, and force a favorable end to the war through significant territorial gains. But standing defiantly in their way was a tenacious American force under the command of Brigadier General Alexander Macomb on land and Commodore Thomas Macdonough on the lake. Macdonough, a seasoned and brilliant naval officer, had prepared meticulously. With a hastily assembled but fiercely determined fleet, he positioned his ships strategically in Plattsburgh Bay, ready to challenge the British flotilla and deny them control of Lake Champlain. As the late summer sun rose on September 11, 1814, the deceptively calm waters of Lake Champlain belied the storm about to break. The British fleet, larger and more heavily armed, advanced into the bay with the explicit intention to crush the American squadron. Cannon smoke would soon cloud the sky. The thunder of artillery and the cries of men would fill the air as both fleets engaged in a desperate, brutal, close-quarters battle. Macdonough's ships were anchored in a strong, defensive line, meticulously arranged to maximize firepower and protect vital points. The British vessels moved forward, confident in their superior numbers and overwhelming firepower. The first shots echoed across the lake, marking the beginning of a brutal, hour-long exchange of fire that rigorously tested every ounce of skill, bravery, and unwavering resolve. Cannons roared from both sides, sending plumes of smoke and splintered wood into the air. The battle unfolded with a deadly, intricate choreography. Macdonough's flagship, the USS Saratoga, sustained heavy damage, her sails torn and many guns silenced by the relentless British barrage. But Macdonough, calm and composed amid the chaos, executed a brilliant maneuver, using kedge anchors. He skillfully rotated the Saratoga to bring fresh guns into the fight, completely surprising the British and decisively turning the tide of battle. As the battle wore on, British ships began to falter, their hulls breached, their crews suffering heavy casualties. The Americans, though outgunned, fought with fierce determination, their intimate knowledge of the lake and superior naval tactics giving them a crucial, decisive edge. At last, the British flagship, the Confiance, was badly damaged and forced to surrender, signaling the collapse of British naval power on Lake Champlain. With naval dominance secured, American land forces prepared to meet the British army advancing toward Plattsburgh. General Macomb had meticulously fortified his positions, skillfully utilizing the rugged terrain and hastily constructed defenses to slow the enemy's advance. The British, weary from their devastating naval defeat, launched a series of assaults on American lines, desperately hoping to break through and capture the town. But the Americans held firm. Infantry and militia soldiers, many fighting to defend their homes and families, relentlessly repelled wave after wave of British attacks. The clash of muskets, the roar of cannon, and the cries of wounded men filled the forests and fields around Plattsburgh. The British, demoralized and overextended, eventually withdrew, their hopes for a northern invasion utterly dashed. The victory at Plattsburgh was a profound and deeply symbolic moment. It shattered British plans to carve a path through the northern states and underscored American resilience. More than that, it significantly boosted morale across the young nation, proving that despite setbacks elsewhere, the United States could stand and fight and win against one of the world's greatest military powers. The battle's impact reached far beyond the immediate shores of Lake Champlain. News of the American victory spread swiftly, directly influencing diplomatic negotiations underway in Ghent, Belgium. Britain's defeat significantly weakened their bargaining position, nudging both sides closer to a much-desired peace. The Battle of Plattsburgh was not just a military triumph. It was a decisive factor that helped shape the war's end and the future of the United States. For the men who fought there, on the decks of ships, in the muddy fields, beneath the canopy of trees, the battle was an ultimate test of endurance, courage, and immense sacrifice. They faced the horrors of war, the sharp crack of musket fire, the screams of comrades, the shattering explosions of cannonballs. Yet through it all, their unwavering commitment to their country and cause remained unbroken. In the grand sweep of the War of 1812, the Battle of Plattsburgh stands as a vivid chapter of perseverance and strategic brilliance. It reminds us how geography inspired leadership, and the unyielding spirit of ordinary people converged to defend a fragile nation in its hour of greatest need. It tells a story not just of conflict but of hope for a future where America's independence and sovereignty would endure. As the smoke cleared over Lake Champlain, the flag of the United States still flew proudly over Plattsburgh, a symbol of victory forged by grit, resolve, and the unwavering will to survive. Chapter 20: Peace Talks in Ghent. Diplomats at work. As the guns roared across distant battlefields and the acrid smoke of war lingered over the American frontier and the Canadian wilderness, a different kind of struggle was unfolding thousands of miles away, in the quiet, grand halls of Ghent, a city nestled serenely in the heart of Belgium. Here, amid the polished marble and rich velvet of European diplomacy, emissaries from the United States and Great Britain faced a daunting, monumental task: to end a war that had drained nations, cost thousands of lives, and left deep, festering scars on both sides. The War of 1812, now inexorably entering its third brutal year, had devolved into a grinding stalemate. Neither the Americans nor the British could genuinely claim a decisive victory. Battles had been fought with immense valor and ferocious intensity. From the shores of Lake Erie to the burning streets of Washington, D.C., but the tide of conflict had ebbed and flowed relentlessly without delivering the clear, conclusive triumph either side desperately sought. The war had become exorbitantly costly, financially, politically, and profoundly humanly, and the widespread appetite for peace grew steadily stronger. In August 1814, the United States and Britain dispatched their chief negotiators to Ghent. For the Americans, a distinguished delegation led by John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Albert Gallatin arrived, men of sharp intellect and steadfast patriotism, carrying the fervent hopes of a young nation still fiercely battling to secure its legitimate place on the world stage. Across the grand table sat the British delegation, including Lord Gambier and Lord Bathurst, representatives of an empire weary from the ceaseless conflicts of the Napoleonic Wars, yet absolutely determined to protect its vital interests and maintain its global honor. The setting was austere but palpably charged with tension. The ornate chambers echoed with the quiet rustle of papers, the low murmur of hushed discussion, and the immense weight of unspoken burdens. Here, the clash was no longer of muskets and cannons, but of carefully chosen words, intricate arguments, and delicate, painstaking compromises. The diplomats faced a complex, thorny web of issues: territorial disputes, maritime rights, the fate of Native American lands, and fundamental questions of national sovereignty. Each side came armed not with soldiers, but with meticulously crafted demands and the urgent, overriding desire to avoid further bloodshed. The British began with firm, unyielding positions. They sought to secure their absolute control over Canada and vigorously protect their maritime interests, especially the controversial right to impress sailors, forcibly seizing men from American ships to serve in the Royal Navy, a practice that had ignited much of the conflict. The Americans, on the other hand, vehemently demanded respect for their sovereignty, an unequivocal end to impressment, and the immediate restoration of borders to their pre-war status. They also forcefully pushed for protections for Native American lands, whose precarious fate had been tragically caught in the merciless crossfire of imperial ambitions and relentless frontier expansion. Yet as weeks agonizingly passed, the diplomats discovered that the brutal realities of war and the constantly shifting tides of military fortune had subtly softened their initial demands. The devastating British naval defeat on Lake Champlain and significant setbacks in the Northern Theater had severely eroded their leverage. The Americans, while justly proud of their tenacious resistance and hard-won victories, pragmatically recognized the limitations of their military reach. The war, costly and utterly exhausting, had taken its toll on both nations. Behind closed doors, heated debate raged, tempers flared and then slowly cooled. Long days and nights stretched into seemingly endless weeks. The negotiators grappled with profound questions that could irrevocably shape the future of North America. Could a lasting peace genuinely be built on sincere compromise? Was it truly possible to reconcile the deep wounds of war without forcing either side into humiliating capitulation? How could the fundamental rights of native peoples possibly be safeguarded amid this colossal contest between great powers? Among the many voices, John Quincy Adams stood as a steady, unwavering presence, his keen intellect and formidable diplomatic skill guiding the American delegation. Henry Clay, the fiery orator famously known as the Great Compromiser, argued passionately for a peace that honored the immense sacrifices made and unequivocally ensured the young nation's future. Albert Gallatin, the experienced statesman, worked tirelessly to find common ground, bridging divides with his astute insights. On the British side, their negotiators faced the delicate balance of protecting their empire's sprawling interests, while desperately seeking to end a war that had drained resources urgently needed elsewhere. The breakthrough came not through grand, sweeping gestures, but through quiet, pragmatic realization. Both sides recognized that the wisest course was a return to the status quo ante bellum, a restoration of conditions to what they were before the war. The thorny issues of impressment and Native American territories, for the moment, were deliberately set aside, left to be addressed through future diplomacy. The underlying principle was elegantly simple: peace over continued bloodshed. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was formally signed. It was a document of profound compromise. No outright triumph for either side, but a definitive end to the brutal conflict that had cost so much. The treaty meticulously restored pre-war borders, called for the immediate release of prisoners, and laid the crucial groundwork for improved future relations. News of the treaty, carried across vast oceans and remote frontiers, was met with cautious relief by soldiers and civilians alike. Yet the war did not end immediately. Communication was painstakingly slow, and battles tragically continued in distant places, most famously the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. Fought by forces utterly unaware that peace had already been declared. The conflict, in many profound ways, only truly concluded as the treaty's words spread across the Atlantic and permeated the hearts and minds of the people. The peace talks in Ghent stand as a powerful testament to the enduring power of diplomacy amid the unutterable horrors of war. They reveal how even in the darkest hours, dialogue and reason can, and often do, prevail over wanton violence and utter destruction. The treaty did not solve every single problem, nor did it erase the deep scars left by years of brutal conflict. But it unequivocally provided a path forward, a fragile peace that would ultimately shape the destiny of an entire continent. For the diplomats who labored tirelessly through that bitter winter, the Treaty of Ghent was more than a mere piece of parchment. It was a luminous beacon of hope, a profound recognition of shared humanity. and a timeless reminder that the future truly belonged to those willing to talk, to listen, and to painstakingly build bridges rather than destructive walls. As the sun set on the war, the treaty marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of rebuilding, reconciliation, and the arduous work of forging a lasting peace from the smoldering ashes of conflict. The War of 1812, with all its blood and fire, had finally come to an end, not with a decisive victory, but with the quiet strength of diplomacy and the enduring hope for a better tomorrow. Chapter 21. The Treaty of Ghent, signed but not yet known. On a cold winter's day, December 24, 1814, in the elegant city of Ghent, a treaty was signed that, in theory, formally ended the War of 1812. The ink dried on parchment, meticulously sealing an agreement between two weary nations, the United States and Great Britain, to lay down arms and seek lasting peace. But for the vast majority of the people of America, the news had not yet arrived. The war was officially over, yet the guns still roared, and the lives of countless soldiers and civilians hung precariously in the balance, utterly unaware that the conflict had quietly drawn to a close thousands of miles away. This is a story about the strange, agonizing lag between peace made and peace felt, a profound delay shaped by the inherent limits of communication, the sheer vastness of geographical distance, and the relentless urgency of battle. It is a poignant tale of expectation and ignorance, of fleeting hope and profound despair, of men fighting and dying all while the world shifted irrevocably beneath their very feet. In the early 19th century, information traveled excruciatingly slowly, burdened by the speed of horses, the vagaries of ships, and the unreliability of messengers. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on the 24th of December, but it took weeks filled with agonizing uncertainty, pervasive rumors, and mounting tension, for the news to traverse the immense Atlantic Ocean and finally reach American shores. For the people back home and the soldiers in the field, the war seemed far from over. On the eastern coast of the United States, the news traveled by ship, buffeted by harsh winter storms and treacherous seas. Harbors and ports buzzed with anxious anticipation. Yet no official word came. American commanders, utterly unaware of the treaty, meticulously prepared for the continuation of hostilities. This profound disconnection between diplomatic reality and battlefield action would have devastating consequences. Far to the south, in the sweltering swamps and bayous of Louisiana, General Andrew Jackson and his ragtag army, a diverse coalition of militia, free men of color, Native American allies, and regular soldiers, were assembling to defend New Orleans from an approaching British force. The stakes were incredibly high. Control of the Mississippi River and the vital gateway to the vast American interior hung precariously in the balance. Yet Jackson's determined defenders were completely unaware that peace had already been agreed upon in Europe. For them, every shot fired, every cannonball launched, was a desperate fight for survival and for the young nation's honor. Meanwhile, on the northern frontier, skirmishes and battles continued unabated. British and American soldiers clashed relentlessly along the rugged border between the United States and Canada. Families in small towns lived with the constant, gnawing fear of raids and brutal reprisals. Messages carried by riders and ships were slow, sometimes intercepted or tragically delayed. The war seemed endless, its brutal momentum unbroken by the fragile peace being painstakingly shaped in Ghent. The treaty itself was a document of profound compromise. It called for the return of conquered territories to their pre-war owners, the immediate release of prisoners, and the resumption of friendly relations. Notably, it made no explicit mention of the thorny issue of impressment, the practice of forcibly recruiting sailors into the British Navy, which had been a central cause of the war. That particular problem had largely faded in importance with the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Nor did it address the fate of Native American lands in any lasting or definitive way, leaving many indigenous peoples to face the consequences without a clear protector. As diplomats in Ghent laid down their pens, meticulously sealing a treaty born of sheer exhaustion and raw pragmatism, the real war, the war of flesh and blood, of muskets and bayonets, was still being brutally fought. News would not arrive in time to prevent the immense bloodshed at New Orleans, where one of the most decisive battles of the entire war tragically took place on January 8, 1815. In that fight, General Jackson's forces would deliver a crushing defeat to the British, a victory that galvanized American pride and identity. But this victory, glorious and widely celebrated, was fought after the war had officially ended. The Treaty of Ghent, though signed, was not yet known. It was a stark reminder of how human lives and the relentless tides of war do not always align neatly with the signatures on a page or the grand proclamations of governments. Across the nation, families waited anxiously. Soldiers on the frontier held their positions, unsure when the fighting would finally end. Townspeople wondered what the future held, what the true costs of this bloody conflict would be, and whether peace was finally within reach. When the news finally arrived, months later, the country breathed a collective sigh of profound relief. The war was over. The immense sacrifices, the pervasive suffering, and the grinding struggles had culminated in a peace that, while imperfect, allowed the United States to continue its crucial journey as a sovereign nation. The Treaty of Ghent did not solve every problem, nor did it erase the deep scars left by years of conflict. But it marked a pivotal turning point, a moment when diplomacy, however delayed, ultimately overcame the chaos and destruction of war. This chapter of history teaches us about the enduring power and inherent limits of communication in times of conflict. It reveals how war can tragically outpace peace, how battles can rage on even after leaders have agreed to stop fighting, and it reminds us that behind every treaty, every political decision, are real people, soldiers, families, civilians, waiting in hope and uncertainty for the promise of peace to finally reach them at last. Chapter 22: The Battle of New Orleans, Jackson's Miracle. The morning of January 8, 1815, dawned cold and misty over the vast wetlands surrounding New Orleans. A dense fog clung stubbornly to the swampy banks of the Mississippi River, effectively hiding the movements of a formidable British force that had crossed the sea to strike at the very heart of America's southern frontier. They came with thousands of battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of the grueling Napoleonic Wars, supremely confident in their ability to swiftly capture this vital port city, a strategic gateway to the vast interior of the young nation. But waiting for them on the American side stood a man and an army unlike any the British had ever faced before. General Andrew Jackson, a rugged and fiercely determined commander, led a ragtag force of militia, free African Americans, Native American allies, pirates, and regular soldiers. These diverse men had little in common save for a fierce, unyielding will to defend their home against overwhelming odds. They were ready to turn back the British invasion. What followed was a battle that would become legendary, not simply because of its ferocity or scale, but because of its peculiar timing and the immense stakes involved. Unknown to both sides, peace had already been agreed upon in Ghent, thousands of miles away. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed weeks earlier, officially ending the war, yet this vital news had not reached America. The guns had not fallen silent. The blood of hundreds would be tragically spilled on this swampy battlefield in a fight that history would forever remember as a true miracle. General Jackson's preparations were meticulous, understanding the treacherous terrain far better than his enemy. He ordered his men to construct earthworks, improvise fortifications that would shelter his troops and funnel the British into deadly crossfire. His forces numbered around 4,500 men, significantly outnumbered by the 8,000 British soldiers poised to attack. The disparity in numbers, however, belied the unwavering determination and ingenious tactics of Jackson's army. As the British troops advanced in the early morning hours, their movements masked by fog and initial confusion, they encountered fierce, relentless resistance. Musket volleys and thunderous cannon fire tore through their ranks. The British tried repeatedly to scale the American defenses, but each assault was met with withering, devastating fire. The muddy ground, the tangled swamps, and the steely resolve of Jackson's men transformed the battlefield into a deadly trap. The battle raged for hours. British officers fell. Soldiers were mowed down by musket balls, and the agonizing cries of the wounded echoed across the misty landscape. Jackson's men, despite their varied backgrounds and limited training, fought with a discipline and courage born of sheer desperation and unyielding hope. They held the line against wave after wave of attacks, inflicting severe casualties on the British, who were utterly unprepared for such tenacity. Amid the chaos, Jackson emerged as a commanding, inspiring figure, motivating his troops with his unwavering presence and indomitable resolve. His leadership was decisively pivotal, his orders clear and urgent. He knew that if New Orleans fell, the entire Mississippi Valley might be lost, and with it, the very hopes of a growing nation. He fought not just for territory but for the fundamental future of the United States. When the smoke finally cleared, the British were forced to retreat. The Americans had won a stunning, resounding victory. British casualties numbered over 2,000 dead and wounded. American losses were comparatively light, numbering around 70 dead. The disparity was staggering, a testament to the highly effective defense mounted by Jackson and his men. News of the victory spread quickly across the United States, igniting a wave of patriotic pride and jubilant celebration. The Battle of New Orleans became a powerful symbol of American resilience and determination, a story of how a diverse, improvised force could defeat the might of the British Empire against all odds. Yet the victory carried a profound irony that few fully grasped at the time. The war was technically over. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed before the battle even began. If only news had traveled faster, the bloodshed might have been avoided. But in the face of uncertainty, men had fought with everything they had, shaping the narrative of a nation's identity in the process. Andrew Jackson emerged from the battle a national hero. His decisive leadership at New Orleans catapulted him to widespread fame and set the stage for his future role as one of America's most influential, and, indeed, controversial presidents. The victory instilled in Americans a renewed sense of confidence and unity after years of grinding conflict and immense hardship. More than a mere military triumph, the Battle of New Orleans was a defining moment in the War of 1812 and in the story of the United States itself. It powerfully demonstrated the country's innate capacity to defend itself, to endure adversity, and to emerge stronger from profound hardship. It forged a lasting legacy of courage, sacrifice, and unyielding tenacity, a legacy that would echo through generations. In the quiet swamps and fields where so many had fought and fallen, the nation's future was being written, not with ink, but with blood and grit, with hope and unshakable determination. The Battle of New Orleans was, in every profound sense, America's miracle. Chapter 23: The Hero Emerges, Rise of Andrew Jackson. In the wake of the Battle of New Orleans, as the smoke settled and the nation collectively caught its breath, one figure stood unmistakably at the very center of the American story. A man whose fierce determination and unyielding spirit had become a luminous beacon of hope and pride for a young republic. Andrew Jackson, the general who had defied all odds and crushed the British invasion, emerged not just as a military victor but as a powerful symbol of America's resilience and its burgeoning promise. Jackson's rise was meteoric. Before the war, he was a frontier lawyer and a judge in Tennessee, known for his rugged demeanor and uncompromising sense of justice. Yet he was far from a polished politician or a member of the Eastern elite. He was a man of the raw frontier, rough, bold, and deeply shaped by the harsh realities of life on the edge of the expanding nation. His life was indelibly marked by personal hardship, numerous duels, and battles not only on the field but in the courtroom, and, indeed, in the hearts of his people. The War of 1812 changed everything. His leadership during the conflict transformed him from a regional figure into a national icon. At New Orleans, he had accomplished what many believed impossible. He had united a disparate group of fighters, militia, Native Americans, freedmen, and even privateers, into an incredibly effective force that stood firm against the mighty British Empire. His victory was more than tactical, it was profoundly symbolic. It was a powerful declaration that America, though young and untested, could defend itself with unwavering courage and unshakable resolve. The public celebrated Jackson with fervent enthusiasm. Newspapers hailed him as the hero of New Orleans, and his fame spread far beyond the southern states. He became the living embodiment of the American spirit, a rugged individualist who personified the ideals of bravery, independence, and relentless perseverance. Stories of his exploits circulated widely, stirring immense pride and inspiring countless citizens. But Jackson's rise was not without controversy. His fierce temperament and aggressive style made him a polarizing figure. He was admired by many for his strength but also feared for his willingness to take bold, sometimes ruthless, actions in battle. He was relentless in politics, and he would prove equally formidable. His victories on the battlefield provided him with a powerful platform. But it was his unparalleled ability to connect with the common man that ensured his lasting appeal. The War of 1812 had revealed deep divisions in American society. Between the established elites of the East and the rugged frontier settlers of the West and South, Jackson, with his humble origins and no-nonsense approach, came to symbolize the rising power of the common man. He was a compelling voice for those who felt overlooked by the traditional centers of power, and he would masterfully harness this immense popular support in the years to come. In the years following the war, Jackson parlayed his military fame into a successful political career. He served as a U.S. Senator and Governor of Florida, a territory recently acquired from Spain. His leadership in Florida, particularly his efforts to suppress Native American resistance and maintain order, further cemented his reputation as a decisive and forceful leader. His presidency, which began in 1829, would be defined by the very same traits that made him a war hero: unwavering determination, a fierce belief in the Union, and an unwavering commitment to expanding democracy. At least for white male citizens, Jackson's policies were fundamentally shaped by his vision of a strong, united America, and he was unafraid to confront what he saw as entrenched interests, including the powerful Second Bank of the United States. Jackson's rise also marked a significant shift in American politics. He was the first president from the West, and his election represented the growing influence of frontier states in national affairs. His approach to leadership, direct, sometimes confrontational, always resolute, set the tone for a new era in American governance. He was both celebrated and reviled, a man who inspired fierce loyalty and provoked equally fierce opposition. His impact on the nation was profound. Under Jackson's leadership, the United States expanded its borders and significantly strengthened its federal government. He championed the idea that government should serve the people, not merely the privileged few. Yet his legacy is complex. While he promoted greater participation in politics for many, his policies toward Native Americans, most notably the Indian Removal Act, would lead to immense suffering and displacement on an enormous scale. Despite the controversies, Jackson's status as a war hero remained central to his identity. His victory at New Orleans was remembered as a defining moment, not only in the War of 1812 but in the very making of the United States. It was a victory that helped forge a powerful sense of national pride and unity at a time when the young country was still finding its way. The story of Andrew Jackson is, in many ways, the very story of America itself, a tale of ambition, conflict, triumph, and profound contradiction. From the battlefields of New Orleans to the hallowed halls of the White House, Jackson's life reflected the tumultuous growth of a nation determined to define its character and its destiny. As the War of 1812 faded into history, Andrew Jackson's star continued to rise. He would become one of the most influential and controversial figures of the early 19th century, a man whose legacy would shape the course of American history long after the cannons fell silent. In the hearts and minds of many Americans, he was the living embodiment of their hopes, their struggles, and their enduring belief in the promise of a nation forged in conflict and bound by unyielding determination. Jackson's rise from frontier soldier to national hero and president powerfully captures the spirit of a country in transition. His story reminds us that history is shaped not only by grand events and pivotal battles but by the complex people who rise to meet their moment, flawed, passionate, and ultimately unforgettable. Chapter 24: Winners, Losers, and Forgotten Voices. The War of 1812 concluded with a treaty signed, guns silenced, and borders left largely unchanged. Yet, beneath the quiet surface of diplomatic papers and official proclamations, the consequences rippled deeply through the lives of nations and peoples. Some emerged triumphant, others defeated, and many were tragically left forgotten in the grand sweep of history. For Britain, the war was, in many respects, a mere sideshow, a distant conflict utterly overshadowed by the colossal existential struggle against Napoleonic France. When Napoleon finally fell in 1814, Britain was at last able to redirect its formidable attention and vast resources to the American front. But even then, the war remained a secondary concern. Britain's primary goal was to defend its Canadian territories and steadfastly maintain its global empire. The British victories at battles like Queenston Heights and the burning of Washington undeniably demonstrated their unwavering resolve and military might. But the Treaty of Ghent ultimately restored the status quo ante bellum, returning boundaries to their pre-war lines. In Britain, the war stirred little enthusiasm. It was a costly conflict with uncertain gains. British society moved on quickly, focusing intently on post-Napoleonic reconstruction and expanding its global influence elsewhere. Yet for the British military, the war offered valuable, hard-won lessons in logistics, naval warfare, and colonial defense, lessons that would profoundly shape future engagements across the sprawling empire. The victory, or rather the sheer survival, of Canada remained a point of immense pride for Britain and its loyalists. Canada, however, told a distinctly different story, a story of survival and identity forged in the brutal crucible of war. For Canadian settlers and British loyalists, the War of 1812 was a defining moment. Against formidable odds, they had withstood multiple American invasions, rallied their militia and indigenous allies, and defended their homes with unyielding tenacity and immense courage. The battles fought along the Niagara frontier, at Queenston Heights, and throughout Upper and Lower Canada, stirred a powerful sense of unity and emerging nationalism. In the aftermath, and to recognize that the end of the war did not mean the end of conflict or struggle for many. In the final reckoning, the War of 1812 shaped the destinies of Britain, Canada, the United States, and native nations in profoundly transformative ways. It helped define borders and identities. It forged heroes and legends. It left scars that would echo through generations. And yet, beyond the treaties and the battles, it was, above all, a human story, a story of immense courage and profound loss, of fleeting hope and grinding hardship, of nations and peoples striving to find their place in a rapidly changing world. The echoes of 1812 continue to resonate, reminding us that history is never simple, and that the voices of the past, winners, losers, and the forgotten alike, deserve to be heard. Chapter 25: The Long-Term Impact on American Identity. The War of 1812 was, in many profound ways, a crucible, a trial by fire that rigorously tested the young American nation's resolve, character, and its nascent vision for itself. Though often overshadowed in history by the Revolutionary War preceding it or the Civil War decades later, this conflict carved deep and lasting marks on the very identity of the United States. It was a war that kindled the fires of nationalism, ignited industrial ambition, and instilled a newfound confidence in the nation's military and its rightful place on the world stage. When the last shots were fired and the Treaty of Ghent was signed, restoring peace but not altering borders, something profound had already begun to change in the American consciousness. The experience of standing toe-to-toe with the British Empire, one of the world's most formidable powers, without being swallowed whole, was no small feat. It was a powerful validation. A declaration that the United States was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a country that could defend itself, that could face immense adversity with unwavering determination, and emerge with its dignity intact. The war, despite its mixed military results and enormous hardships, was remembered by many Americans as a Second War of Independence. This was not just a phrase, but a sentiment deeply felt. The British had tried time and again to intimidate, to restrict, and to control. They had blockaded American ports, interfered with vital trade, impressed sailors, and ignited conflicts on the frontier. Yet at war's end, the United States stood firm. The Republic had survived, its flag still waved freely. This victory, whether in fact decisively won or more symbolic in nature, became the cornerstone of a burgeoning nationalism. Patriotism surged across cities and countryside. The inspiring stories of battles like New Orleans and heroes like Andrew Jackson ignited a new sense of pride. Citizens who had once doubted the young nation's staying power now fervently believed in its promise. The war created a shared narrative of struggle, sacrifice, and unyielding resilience that powerfully helped unify a diverse and expanding population. But nationalism was only part of the legacy. The war exposed serious vulnerabilities in America's economy and infrastructure, prompting urgent efforts to strengthen and modernize. During the conflict, the British blockade strangled American trade and cut off vital supplies. The fragile manufacturing base could not adequately meet wartime demands, and the young nation faced severe shortages of weapons, uniforms, and other essentials. In response, Americans began to look inward, to their own resources, industries, and ingenuity. The war became a powerful catalyst for the rapid growth of American industry. Factories sprang up to produce textiles, firearms, and shipbuilding materials. The experience profoundly demonstrated the critical need for a stronger industrial base that would significantly reduce dependence on foreign goods and make the nation far more self-reliant. This shift had profound long-term effects. The years after the war saw an era of rapid industrial expansion, famously known as the American System. Politicians like Henry Clay championed policies to support internal improvements, roads, canals, and crucial infrastructure that would bind the country together economically and geographically. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was a shining example of this visionary approach, opening new markets and fueling relentless westward growth. The war also prompted much-needed reforms in the American military. The inadequacies revealed during the conflict, poor training, lack of coordination, and insufficient numbers, were painfully clear. In its wake, the United States began to build a more professional and capable army and navy. The lessons learned at sea, where American frigates won hard-fought victories against superior British ships, powerfully demonstrated the importance of a strong naval presence. The Navy was expanded and modernized, and new naval academies were established. On land, militias were reorganized, and the concept of a standing army gained wider acceptance. The war had definitively shown that relying solely on part-time citizen soldiers was insufficient against a professional foe. Confidence in American arms grew, but so did a sober awareness of the pressing need for meticulous preparation and constant readiness. This stronger foundation would serve the nation well in conflicts to come. The impact of the war extended far beyond borders and battlefields. It reshaped American culture and politics. The Democratic-Republican Party, dominant during the war, fully embraced the ideals of self-sufficiency and national pride. The Federalist Party, which had vociferously opposed the war and even discussed secession at the Hartford Convention, faded into political obscurity, widely seen by many as unpatriotic. The era of good feelings that followed the war was marked by a relative political unity, at least for a time. and a strong focus on national growth. Meanwhile, the frontier continued to expand. The war's aftermath removed many Native American allies of the British and shattered much of their resistance. This opened vast new territories to eager American settlers. The nation's relentless push westward, fueled by the burgeoning belief in manifest destiny, was significantly emboldened by the war's outcome. However, this expansion came at a tragic cost to indigenous peoples, whose lands and cultures were further displaced and decimated. In the American imagination, the War of 1812 became the powerful story of a young nation forcefully asserting itself, no longer a mere colony or an afterthought, but a country with its own unique destiny. It was the war that forged iconic American symbols, from the Star-Spangled Banner to the legend of the USS Constitution, the Old Ironsides. It was a war that gave rise to revered heroes: Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Oliver Hazard Perry, men whose names would echo in history and politics for generations. But perhaps most importantly, it was a war that taught Americans to truly believe in themselves. It was irrefutable proof that a republic built on the sacred principles of liberty and democracy could stand strong against imperial power. The war instilled a profound spirit of resilience and self-reliance that would become absolutely central to American identity. Looking back, the War of 1812 was not merely a military conflict. It was a defining moment of transformation. It spurred economic modernization, strengthened national unity, and laid the crucial groundwork for America's future rise. The echoes of this war continue to reverberate throughout the nation's history, reminding us that the forging of identity is often born in struggle, rigorously tested by adversity, and irrevocably shaped by the courage to stand firm. The War of 1812 left an indelible mark on America, a nation still young yet growing fast, still imperfect yet brimming with promise. It was a conflict that shaped more than just borders and battles. It shaped the very soul of a country stepping confidently into its future. Chapter 26. How the War of 1812 shaped North America. The War of 1812, often erroneously called America's Forgotten War, was anything but forgotten in the profound way it shaped the very map and intrinsic character of North America. It was a conflict that rigorously tested existing borders, boldly challenged established empires, and laid the fundamental foundation for the modern nations that now proudly stand on this vast continent. As the smoke cleared and peace finally settled, the intricate legacies of this war began to unmistakably take shape, not merely in meticulously drafted treaties and lines on a map, but in the evolving identities, burgeoning ambitions, and unfolding futures of the diverse peoples who called North America home. At its very heart, the War of 1812 was an existential struggle for power and sovereignty. For the United States, it was a desperate battle to assert itself as a truly independent nation, no longer to be intimidated by British interference, or constrained by the lingering shadow of colonialism. For Britain and its North American colonies, the future Canada, it was a fervent defense of territory, vital trade routes, and core imperial interests against a rapidly growing and increasingly confident neighbor. The war's outcome was paradoxically nuanced. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, meticulously restored pre-war borders without any significant territorial changes. Yet this seemingly quiet conclusion cunningly belied the profound shifts that were subtly underway. The peace that followed was far more than a mere cessation of hostilities. It was the very beginning of a new chapter in the delicate balance of power across North America. One of the most significant and enduring effects of the war was the firm establishment of the United States borders with British North America. The ambiguous boundaries that had fueled tension for decades were now recognized and respected, though disputes and negotiations would continue. The war marked a pivotal turning point where these lines became less battlegrounds and more fixed, permanent borders. The Great Lakes region in particular emerged as a zone of cooperation rather than perpetual conflict. With the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 famously limiting naval armaments and setting a crucial precedent for peaceful demilitarization, For Canada, the war forged a powerful sense of unity and identity, distinctly separate from both Britain and the United States. The successful defense against repeated American invasions and the collective, heroic efforts of British regulars, Canadian militia, and Indigenous allies kindled a profound pride that undeniably contributed to Canada's eventual path to nationhood. The memory of battles fought on Canadian soil became an integral part of a shared narrative of resilience, community, and unyielding survival. Meanwhile, the war's impact on Indigenous nations was devastating and, indeed, irreversible. Many native tribes who had allied with the British in desperate hopes of preserving their lands and traditional ways of life found their position dramatically weakened. The tragic death of visionary leaders like Tecumseh was far more than the mere loss of a military commander. It was the agonizing collapse of a pan-Indigenous resistance movement that had sought to stand as a sovereign force amid the relentlessly encroaching powers. The resulting widespread loss of territory and autonomy set a grim pattern of displacement and marginalization that would tragically continue throughout the 19th century and beyond. In the United States, the war profoundly intensified a spirit of fervent nationalism and the burgeoning concept of manifest destiny. The firm belief that America was divinely destined to expand across the entire continent took root more firmly after the conflict. This powerful vision would relentlessly drive policies and conflicts for decades to come, as settlers pushed aggressively westward into native lands and new states emerged from the untamed frontier. The war had powerfully demonstrated that the United States was a nation on the rise, determined, resilient, and fully capable of defending its cherished sovereignty, economically and militarily. The war served as a stark wake-up call for all parties involved. The British recognized the strategic importance of their North American colonies, but also the immense costs of defending far-flung territories. The United States clearly saw the urgent need for a stronger navy, a better trained army, and a more self-sufficient economy. Canadian militias gained invaluable experience and confidence, and their crucial role in defending their homeland became a point of undeniable national pride. The diplomatic aftermath of the war also significantly shaped future relations. The conflict reinforced the vital importance of negotiation and treaties in managing relations between neighboring nations. The concept of a peaceful border between the United States and Canada became a defining feature of the continent, one of the longest unfortified borders in the world, maintained through skillful diplomacy rather than destructive warfare. The hard-won lessons of 1812 taught that while disputes were inevitable, violence was not the only path. Culturally, the war left enduring symbols and powerful stories that continue to resonate. The Star-Spangled Banner, born from the relentless bombardment of Fort McHenry, became a lasting emblem of American perseverance and national identity. Canadian tales of valor and defense nurtured a collective memory that fed into a distinct national consciousness. Even in Britain, the war served as a poignant reminder of the inherent complexities of empire and the formidable challenges of maintaining global power. As the decades passed, the War of 1812 gradually faded from popular memory in some places, overshadowed by later, more dramatic conflicts. Yet its indelible imprint remained, in the defined borders, in the forged alliances, in the powerful sense of identity and destiny that shaped the very course of North American history. It was a war that underscored both the fragility and the immense strength of young nations, the exorbitant costs of empire, and the enduring power of people determined to chart their own unique futures. Ultimately, the War of 1812 was a defining moment in the making of modern North America. It was a war that rigorously tested boundaries, geographic, political, and cultural, and emerged as a pivotal turning point where the continent's nations began to take the recognizable shape we see today. It was a war that showed the world that the United States was no longer an experiment on the edge of empire, but a formidable force to be reckoned with. It was a war that provided Canada with a solid foundation for a distinct, separate, and proud identity. It was a war that forever altered the tragic fate of Indigenous peoples. marking a harrowing chapter in their history. In the sprawling story of North America, the War of 1812 stands as a powerful reminder that borders are not merely lines on a map. They are the tangible product of struggle, negotiation, and immense human endurance. It reminds us that nations are more than just governments. They are vibrant communities shaped by shared history, immense sacrifice, and the unwavering will to survive. As we reflect on this conflict nearly 2 centuries later, the echoes of the War of 1812 continue to shape our profound understanding of identity, sovereignty, and the complex, rich tapestry that is North America. It was a war that ended with a treaty but began a lasting legacy, a legacy of nations defined not just by land but by the compelling stories they tell, the brutal battles they fought, and the audacious futures they dared to imagine.